This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. The first sign that Thanksgiving was going to collapse came before the wine was poured. Not during the toast, not during the laughter, but the moment I saw my father smiling too widely across the table, like a man who believed the ending of the story had already been decided. That was the mistake, because I had already seen the report. The house in New Orleans had that old Southern habit of holding sound in the walls. Every word spoken in the dining room seemed to echo faintly off the hallway and return a second later, softer but clearer. My parents loved that house for exactly that reason. It made every dinner feel larger than life. It made their stories sound grand. It made their version of the past harder to challenge. The table stretched nearly the full length of the room. Polished walnut, inherited from my grandfather, always set too formally for a family that never quite behaved like one. Candles burned slowly along the center, the flame reflections dancing in the crystal glasses. 20 people had come, friends from church, neighbors, 2 of my father's business associates, a cousin who had flown in from Baton Rouge, and most importantly for my parents, several people who had only ever known the official family narrative. In that story, I was the difficult one, the ungrateful son, the one who left, the one who never quite measured up. I took my seat halfway down the table and let the noise of conversation roll over me. Forks clinked against plates. Someone laughed loudly near the end of the table. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes hung thick in the air. Across from me sat my younger sibling, Ava. She was quiet tonight. That alone was unusual. Ava had always been the one expected to smooth things over. The peacemaker, the one who translated our parents' moods into something polite enough for company. Tonight, she mostly watched. Her eyes moved between me and our parents like someone tracking a storm forming on the horizon. My mother stood near the head of the table, adjusting the sleeve of her blouse with small, careful movements. Her voice carried easily when she spoke. She had practiced this moment. You could tell. Thanksgiving was not really the reason for the dinner. Officially, we were also celebrating my parents' anniversary. 32 years of marriage, the kind of number people like to applaud. My father tapped a spoon gently against his glass. The room softened into attention, and then the performance began. He spoke about family, about tradition, about how important it was to stay connected through difficult times. Every word carefully chosen, every pause deliberate. People nodded. They had heard versions of this speech before. And what they had not heard was the part my parents preferred to keep quiet. That the son they described as unreliable now owned a restaurant 2 miles from the French Quarter that had been fully booked for the past 8 months. That the son they liked to portray as irresponsible had built his entire adult life on one habit: documentation, paperwork, records, receipts. Because growing up in this family had taught me something early. Memory was flexible, but signatures were not. I took a sip of water and listened as my father continued speaking. He was building towards something. You could hear it in the tone. The gentle nostalgia was too polished, the smiles too rehearsed. Across the table, Ava shifted slightly in her chair. She knew it too. My mother placed her hand lightly on my father's arm when he reached the part of the speech where he talked about sacrifice. Parents give everything, he said. Children sometimes forget that. Several guests murmured agreement. One of my father's friends chuckled softly. I could feel the moment tightening around the table. Then my name entered the story. Miles, my father said, with that soft, theatrical sigh he liked to use when presenting disappointment as wisdom. There it was. The role. The scapegoat. The narrative required someone to absorb the weight of family tension so everyone else could feel comfortable. For years, that someone had been me. I let him speak. I let the story unfold exactly the way he expected. Because the thing about documentation is that it rewards patience. My mother leaned forward slightly as he described how difficult it had been raising a son who never quite appreciated what his parents had done for him. Someone across the table gave a sympathetic look. The performance was working. My father raised his glass, and then he added the detail that was supposed to seal the moment. He mentioned responsibility, bills, financial strain. He spoke carefully, but the implication hung clear in the air that I had been a burden, a familiar story, a reliable one. Except for one small complication. 3 weeks earlier, a compliance report had arrived at my restaurant office. At first, I thought it was a routine banking notice, but when I opened the envelope and saw the list of accounts tied to my name, something cold settled in my stomach. Utility contracts, credit lines. Several accounts opened over the past 4 years, none of them opened by me. All of them tied to one address, my parents' house, the same house we were sitting in now. At the time, I did not call anyone. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I did what survival in this family had always required. I collected information because stories could be denied. But institutions did not argue with documentation. My father finished the toast with a final line about forgiveness and family unity. Glasses lifted, people smiled, wine was poured, and the room believed the scene was complete. But the truth was sitting quietly inside the folder in my coat pocket. Ava's eyes flicked toward me again. She noticed the small movement when I slid my hand inside the coat. She knew that look. It was the same look I used to get before exams in school, before business negotiations, before moments when patience stopped being useful. My father sat back down, satisfied. He believed he had just reminded the room exactly who I was. What he didn't realize was that dessert had not been served yet, and the night was only beginning to show its real story. Part 2. The strange thing about family performances is how comfortable they become for the audience. Once people accept the roles, they stop questioning the script. The ungrateful son, the long-suffering parents, the responsible younger sibling. The narrative settles in the room like familiar furniture. And for years I had allowed that story to exist because fighting it inside the family only strengthened it. The more you argued, the more emotional you appeared. The more emotional you appeared, the easier it became to call you unstable. But paperwork was different. Paperwork didn't argue. Paperwork waited. The room relaxed after my father's toast, conversation rising again in small clusters along the table. Plates were passed. Someone at the far end asked about a fishing trip. Laughter drifted across the candles. On the surface, everything looked normal, which was exactly what my parents wanted. My mother began circulating with a polite smile, refilling glasses, touching shoulders, playing the gracious host. Every movement precise, every expression controlled. She was good at this part. Image had always been her strongest talent. Across from me, Ava pushed her fork slowly through a slice of turkey, but barely ate. Her attention kept drifting toward the head of the table where our parents sat. She had grown up inside the same system I had. She knew the signals. My father leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the performance he had just delivered. A few of the guests complimented him on the speech. He accepted their praise with that same humble expression he used whenever someone reinforced his version of reality. The problem was that institutions didn't care about speeches. They cared about forms. I had spent the past 3 weeks reviewing every page in the compliance packet. 3 different banks, 4 utility providers, 2 lines of credit, every one of them opened using my identity, my social security number, my name, my signature, except the signatures weren't mine. The first time I saw them, I felt something strange. Not anger, not shock, just confirmation. Because if you grow up as the scapegoat in a family, you eventually learn that certain lines will be crossed. You just don't know when or how boldly. What fascinated me most wasn't even the accounts themselves. It was the confidence behind them. Whoever had done this believed the story of me would protect them. That if questions were ever asked, the explanation would be simple. Miles had financial problems. Miles was irresponsible. Miles probably forgot he opened them. The family narrative had been carefully constructed for years to make that explanation believable, which meant the decision to use my identity wasn't just about money. It was about control and reputation. My mother returned to the table and took her seat beside my father. She glanced briefly in my direction, her expression soft but measured. A quick evaluation. She was checking to see how well the speech had landed. I gave her exactly the reaction she expected. Nothing. Neutral. Quiet. The son who absorbed criticism and avoided conflict. That role had protected me for a long time. Across the room, one of my father's business friends began telling a story about a property dispute in Baton Rouge. Something about a neighbor refusing to move a fence line. Everyone listened politely. But I noticed something else. A man sitting 2 seats down from my father had gone unusually quiet. Daniel Ruiz. I knew him from work, not from family gatherings, not from church, from a licensing meeting 6 months earlier related to restaurant inspections. He worked with a regional compliance office that occasionally reviewed financial disclosures tied to hospitality businesses. We had exchanged cards once. That was it. I wasn't even sure my parents knew we had met before. Daniel was watching me now, not openly, just the small, attentive look of someone who recognizes a detail that doesn't quite match the story being told. It didn't surprise me. People who work with documents develop that instinct. Ava noticed him too. Her eyes flicked from Daniel to me, then back to our parents. Something in her posture shifted. She knew the room was changing, even if no one else had realized it yet. My father leaned forward again, eager to steer the conversation back toward family nostalgia. He began describing how difficult the past few years had been managing the house, property taxes rising, maintenance costs, the burden of keeping everything afloat. The implication hovered quietly in the air. Parents struggling, children who didn't help enough. It was a familiar structure, except one small detail didn't match the story. Several of the utility accounts listed in the compliance report had been opened specifically to service this house. Electric, water, gas, all tied to my name, all unpaid for months. Technically speaking, according to the paperwork, I was responsible for them. If someone decided to pursue the debt legally, the first person they would contact would be me, which meant something else was also true. If someone investigated how those accounts were opened, the trail would lead here. I took another slow sip of water and let the room continue enjoying its comfortable narrative, because the timing mattered. The compliance office had not sent the report to me alone. They had also flagged the activity for internal review, which meant eventually someone from the institutions involved would ask questions. But tonight was different. Tonight, the room was full of witnesses, friends, neighbors, people who had spent years believing my parents' polished version of the family. And the truth about reputations is simple. They hold power only until someone places evidence beside them. Ava set her fork down quietly. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but unusually firm. She asked our father something simple, something harmless on the surface, about the house deed. My father blinked slightly, surprised by the question. He answered casually, waving a hand as if the details were unimportant. But I saw Daniel Ruiz shift slightly in his chair. That one phrase had caught his attention. House deed. Documentation. Property. The conversation drifted briefly to something else, but the tension at the table had changed shape. People could feel it, even if they didn't know why. My mother stood again, announcing dessert. Pecan pie, her specialty. She moved toward the kitchen, calling Ava to help bring the plates. Ava hesitated for half a second before standing. As she passed behind my chair, she paused just long enough to whisper one quiet sentence. "You brought the report, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She already knew. Because the strange thing about family systems is that the people inside them often recognize the moment the pattern finally breaks. And somewhere between the turkey and the pecan pie, my sibling had realized something important. The story our parents had told for years was about to meet something much harder to control: evidence. Part 3. The kitchen in my parents' house had always been louder than the dining room. Not because people spoke louder there, but because the walls didn't soften anything. Plates clattered, cabinet doors snapped shut, running water echoed off tile. It was a room where conversations became sharper whether you meant them to or not. Ava disappeared into that noise with my mother, carrying the first stack of dessert plates. I stayed at the table. My father leaned back again, stretching his shoulders with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the evening was progressing exactly as planned. The guests were comfortable, the story had been reinforced, and the social order of the family had been publicly displayed. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. But the longer you spend building a life around documentation, the more you begin to notice something subtle about people who rely on narratives instead of facts. They relax too early. My father turned toward Daniel Ruiz. He didn't know Daniel very well. In fact, I was fairly certain he thought Daniel was simply one of the neighbors from 3 streets over who occasionally attended community events. That assumption made him comfortable. He began explaining something about the neighborhood association, about rising insurance costs after the last hurricane season. It was the kind of safe, neutral conversation people use to fill space while waiting for dessert. Daniel nodded politely, but his eyes drifted toward me once more, just briefly. It was not curiosity, it was recognition. And that tiny shift in attention changed the shape of the room in ways my father had not yet noticed. One of the cousins began telling a story about an old family road trip to Florida. The table laughed at the predictable parts. My mother's voice floated back from the kitchen, asking Ava to bring more forks. I listened to all of it with the same calm focus I had used 3 weeks earlier while reading the compliance report line by line. Every account, every date, every signature. The first utility account had been opened almost 4 years ago. Electric service. The application had been submitted online. The attached identification scan was a copy of my driver's license, except the license number was slightly wrong, 1 digit reversed. It was the kind of mistake someone might make if they were copying information quickly from memory, rather than from the physical card. The second account was water service, opened 6 months later. This time, the driver's license number was correct. The credit line came a year after that. And the signature on the digital agreement was a carefully drawn version of my name. Too careful. Anyone who has signed the same name thousands of times develops a rhythm. Real signatures are quick, imperfect. This one looked like someone had studied it before writing, which meant something else. Whoever did it had access to examples of my signature. School forms, old paperwork, family documents, things stored inside this house. I had noticed all of that weeks ago. What interested me more was the timeline. The accounts were opened during the same years my father liked to tell people I had been financially unstable. The same years he described as proof that I couldn't manage responsibility. At the time, I thought the irony might actually make me laugh. Instead, it made something else clear. The story about me had not been spontaneous. It had been preparation. Across the table, Daniel cleared his throat slightly. He asked my father a small question about property ownership, just casual conversation, or at least it sounded that way to anyone not paying attention. My father answered quickly, too quickly. Yes, he said, the house had been in the family for years. Technically still under a shared structure, but everything was straightforward, nothing complicated. Daniel nodded slowly. I saw the moment the detail didn't quite settle properly in his mind, because compliance officers hear that tone often, nothing complicated. It usually means the opposite. My mother returned from the kitchen carrying the first pie. She placed it carefully in the center of the table like a ceremonial object. The smell of warm pecans and brown sugar drifted through the room. Everyone brightened. Dessert has a way of resetting the atmosphere at family dinners. It signals the closing act. Except tonight, the timing of dessert was about to complicate things. Ava followed behind her with the plates. Her face had the same composed expression she used when handling difficult customers at the cafe she managed across town. But her eyes found mine again, and there was something new in them now. Not uncertainty. Decision. She began placing plates around the table. When she reached Daniel, she paused for half a second, just long enough for him to say something quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Ava's reaction. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. She nodded once, then continued distributing the plates. My father lifted his fork, ready to resume the role of generous host. Before anyone could begin eating, he raised his glass again for another short comment. This one less formal. Just a closing thought about gratitude, about family support, about how everyone in the room had played a role in helping keep things together through difficult times. The implication was obvious. He was reinforcing the narrative one last time before the night ended. Except he made one small miscalculation. He looked directly at me while saying it. And Daniel Ruiz noticed. Noticed the way my father's voice softened slightly with controlled disappointment. Noticed the subtle shift in the room as several guests glanced toward me with the quiet sympathy reserved for family disappointments. Daniel set his fork down. He hadn't taken a bite yet. Neither had I. The compliance report in my coat pocket felt heavier than paper should. Because documents do something, stories can't. They create a timeline, and timelines expose patterns. My father finished speaking and finally cut into the pie. Plates began moving again. Conversation resumed. But now the room contained 3 people who understood that something larger was unfolding. Me, Daniel, and Ava. The rest of the table still believed they were attending a polite Thanksgiving dinner. Ava returned to her chair and picked up her fork. But she didn't eat. Instead, she looked directly at our father, then at our mother, and then slowly she asked the question that would quietly move the evening into a different direction. She asked how long the house utilities had been under my name. The fork in my father's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. And for the first time all night, the performance cracked just enough for the room to feel it. Part 4. The silence that followed Ava's question lasted less than 3 seconds. But in a room full of people who believed they understood the story of our family, those 3 seconds felt long enough to rearrange the furniture of the evening. My father lowered his fork slowly, not abruptly. He was too practiced for that. But the small delay in his movement was noticeable if you were watching closely. I was watching. So was Daniel. My mother's smile remained in place, but it shifted slightly at the edges, like a photograph beginning to crease. Ava sat perfectly still. Her voice had not been loud when she asked the question. It had been almost casual. But the words themselves had weight, and once they landed on the table, they didn't move. How long the house utilities had been under my name. My father gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they want something to sound harmless. He waved his hand slightly as if brushing away a misunderstanding. He said the accounts had probably been arranged that way years ago for convenience. Families did that all the time. Nothing unusual about it. His tone was smooth again by the end of the sentence. Several guests nodded reflexively. The explanation sounded reasonable, except for one detail. He hadn't looked at me when he said it. Instead, his eyes had moved briefly toward my coat hanging over the back of my chair. Just for a moment, but long enough. People who work with compliance reports notice things like that. Daniel Ruiz leaned forward slightly. He rested his elbows on the table with the relaxed posture of someone enjoying dinner conversation. But his next question was precise. He asked whether the accounts had been transferred formally or simply opened under a family arrangement. The wording mattered, because formal transfers create documentation. Family arrangements usually don't. My father blinked once. It was subtle. But again, if you were watching carefully, you could see the moment his mind began adjusting the narrative. He said something about paperwork being complicated years ago when everyone was busy. My mother added a quick explanation about how helpful it had been when I was younger and still living nearby. The two of them worked smoothly together, filling the space with just enough detail to keep the conversation moving. But the answers didn't actually address the question. Daniel nodded politely. He didn't challenge them. Not yet. Across the table, a couple who had been listening quietly exchanged a glance. The husband shifted slightly in his chair. Something about the tone of the conversation had changed. People couldn't always identify why, but they could feel it. Ava picked up her fork again and cut a small piece of pie. She still didn't eat it. Instead, she asked another question. This one sounded even simpler. She asked whether the accounts were still active. My mother's smile tightened. Just slightly. She said she believed everything was current. Bills were handled. Nothing to worry about. The phrase "nothing to worry about" hovered in the air like a small warning sign. Because the people at this table had spent years hearing my parents describe me as the one who created financial problems. Which meant if the accounts were in my name and if something was wrong with them, then the narrative pointed naturally toward me. That was the trap my parents believed they had constructed. What they didn't know was that the compliance report had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and compliance offices rarely send letters for no reason. Daniel picked up his water glass. He didn't drink from it. Instead, he turned slightly toward me, just enough to bring me into the conversation without appearing confrontational. He asked if I had been managing the accounts personally. It was a neutral question, a professional one, the kind that appears harmless unless you know what it implies. For the first time all evening, several heads around the table turned fully toward me. My father's shoulders stiffened. My mother's smile held, but now there was tension behind it. They had expected the narrative to remain one-directional tonight. Them speaking, me absorbing. They had not expected questions that required specific answers. I set my fork down beside the plate. The pecan pie sat untouched. For a moment, I considered how many Thanksgiving dinners had passed in this house with the same quiet rhythm. My father telling stories, my mother smoothing the edges, Ava trying to keep peace, and me playing the role assigned to me years earlier. The difficult child, the disappointment, the unreliable one. It was a role designed to make every accusation believable, even financial ones, which is why the accounts had been opened in my name, because if anyone ever asked, the explanation would sound obvious, except now someone was asking, and that someone worked with documentation. I reached slowly into my coat pocket, not dramatically, just the calm movement of someone retrieving a piece of paper. The room quieted slightly as I unfolded the thin folder. Several people leaned back in their chairs, others leaned forward. They didn't know what was happening yet, but they understood instinctively that the tone of the evening had shifted again. My father cleared his throat. He said my name, not loudly, just enough to suggest caution. I ignored it, because the truth about family systems is simple. They depend on silence. And once someone decides not to provide that silence anymore, the structure begins to wobble. I placed the folder on the table. Daniel recognized the format immediately. Compliance offices use standardized headers, bank insignias, reference numbers, the kind of paperwork that carries quiet authority. My mother's eyes moved toward the top page. Her smile disappeared completely. My father leaned forward slightly, trying to see the text before anyone else could. But Daniel was faster. He read the first line, then the second. And I saw the exact moment the story in the room stopped belonging to my parents. Because institutions do not care about family narratives. They care about signatures. And the signatures on those accounts were about to become the most important detail in the room. Part 5. The moment Daniel recognized the document, the temperature of the room changed. Not physically, but socially. It is a subtle shift that happens when authority enters a conversation unexpectedly. People sit a little straighter, voices lower. The comfortable rhythm of casual storytelling begins to feel fragile. The compliance report was only 3 pages thick, but the header alone carried enough weight to silence the table. Daniel didn't reach for it immediately. That was the interesting part. He simply leaned closer, reading the visible lines without touching the paper, his expression calm but focused. People who work around financial documentation develop a particular kind of patience. They never rush toward a document. They let the document reveal itself. Across the table, my father tried to recover the atmosphere with a light laugh. He said something about paperwork always making things look more serious than they really were. No one laughed with him. The guests were reading the room now, and the room was beginning to notice something unusual. My mother's eyes had locked onto the report with the stillness of someone watching a small crack spread across glass. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair. She had stopped pretending to eat. Her fork rested beside the plate, untouched. I turned the first page slowly so the header faced outward. Regional Compliance Review Notice. Account Identity Verification Flag. 3 institutions listed beneath it. Electric Service, Water Utility, Consumer Credit Line, all under one name. Miles Sinclair. The silence thickened. My father cleared his throat again. This time the sound came out dry. He said the banks always made mistakes. Paperwork errors happened all the time. Systems mixed things up. He spoke faster now, stacking explanations before anyone could ask questions. But the thing about explanations is that they require people to already trust the speaker. And for the first time in many years, that trust in the room had paused. Daniel finally lifted his hand and gently pulled the report closer. Not aggressively, just professionally. He read the first paragraph carefully, then the second, the third. By the time he reached the list of account numbers, the expression on his face had changed from polite curiosity to quiet concentration. Someone at the far end of the table shifted their chair. The scraping sound seemed louder than it should have been. My mother tried to reclaim control. She leaned forward with a reassuring smile aimed at the guests. She said these things always looked confusing when printed out. Family accounts often moved between names for convenience. Everyone understood that. Except Daniel wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the signature samples attached to the report. 2 columns. Verified signatures, submitted signatures, side by side. Even from across the table, the difference was obvious. One column showed my real signature pulled from restaurant licensing paperwork. Fast, natural, slightly angled. The other column showed the signatures used to open the accounts. Careful, deliberate, almost traced. Daniel placed one finger lightly on the page. He did not accuse anyone. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked the question, when had these accounts been authorized? The wording mattered. Authorized, not opened. Authorized implies permission. My father leaned forward quickly, too quickly. He said something about helping me manage things years ago when I was overwhelmed. Helping family members was normal. Everyone did it. My mother nodded beside him. But the explanation arrived before the question had fully finished leaving Daniel's mouth, which is another detail compliance officers notice. Daniel turned 1 page further. The timeline appeared. 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, several late payments, 1 account sent to collections, all under my name, all linked to the address of this house. The same house where my father had just finished explaining how difficult it had been to manage expenses. The irony hung in the air like humidity. Someone at the table coughed quietly. A guest who had earlier nodded sympathetically during my father's speech now looked uncertain, because something about the narrative had begun to unravel. Ava broke the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. She asked a single question. If the accounts were open to help Miles, why didn't he know about them? My father's mouth opened, then closed again. He hadn't prepared an answer for that one. My mother tried. She said I had always been forgetful with finances. Sometimes parents had to step in quietly. Daniel finally looked up from the report. He studied my father for a moment. Then he asked another small question. Had I ever signed the authorization forms in person? The room went still because that question had a simple answer. Either yes or no. My father hesitated. That hesitation lasted barely a second, but it was long enough. I reached across the table and flipped to the final page. The compliance report contained one more section. Identity verification concern, highlighted in pale yellow. The report stated that the signatures used to open the accounts did not match verified signatures on file. It also stated that the institutions had attempted to contact the account holder, me, which was why the envelope had arrived at my restaurant office. Daniel read that section slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair. The movement was small, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. My father spoke quickly again. He said the banks misunderstood things all the time. These matters could be sorted out privately. No need to make it complicated. No need for outsiders to get involved. That last phrase landed heavily in the room, because Daniel Ruiz was, technically speaking, an outsider. But he was also someone who understood how institutions respond when identity verification flags appear. And institutions do not resolve those questions quietly. Daniel folded his hands together on the table. He looked at me now, not as the difficult son described earlier in the evening, but as the documented account holder listed on the report. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, professional, almost gentle. He asked whether I had already contacted the banks about the unauthorized accounts. My father's chair creaked slightly as he shifted. My mother's hands tightened around her napkin. Ava's eyes moved from Daniel to me. The room waited, because everyone understood something important now. The story had changed owners, and the next sentence would determine who controlled the ending. Part 6. There is a particular silence that settles over a room when everyone realizes the conversation has crossed an invisible line. Not the silence of politeness, not the silence of awkwardness, but the silence that comes when people understand they're witnessing something real, something that will not return to normal once the next sentence is spoken. The candles on the table flickered softly in the still air. Someone's phone buzzed faintly from a jacket pocket across the room, then went quiet again. 20 people sat around the table, and every one of them was now watching me. My father shifted in his chair again. The movement was restless this time. He looked from Daniel to the paperwork, then back to me. He had spent years constructing a version of me that could be dismissed easily. Impulsive, disorganized, financially careless, but the person sitting in front of him tonight had brought documentation. That detail was beginning to make the room uncomfortable. Daniel's question still hung there. Had I contacted the banks? It was not an accusation. Not yet. Just a procedural step. The kind that begins a chain reaction. I folded my hands on the table. The report remained open between us, the highlighted section visible to anyone leaning forward far enough to read it. My mother's voice arrived first. She spoke quickly, her tone carefully balanced between reassurance and irritation. She said there was no reason to involve banks in family misunderstandings. These things happen sometimes when relatives helped each other manage responsibilities. It was simply a matter of clarifying paperwork. Her words were smooth, but the speed betrayed something else. Urgency. My father nodded beside her, eager to reinforce the point. He said the matter could be handled privately. No need to escalate things. No need to bring institutions into family matters. The phrase family matters echoed around the table. Several guests looked relieved to hear it. People prefer conflicts that can be solved quietly, especially during holiday dinners. But Daniel did not look relieved. He remained very still, studying the report. When he finally spoke again, his voice was neutral, almost academic. He said identity verification flags were rarely categorized as family misunderstandings. The room grew even quieter. A cousin at the far end of the table set down his fork slowly. My father forced a small laugh. He said the banks like to complicate simple things. Technology made mistakes. Online forms got mixed up. He waved vaguely toward the report. Paperwork again, always making things look worse than they really were. Daniel turned one page back and tapped the timeline section gently. He didn't argue. He simply pointed out that the accounts had been opened over a 4-year period. Not all at once. Separate applications, separate signatures, separate authorizations. The implication was obvious. Mistakes usually happen once. Patterns happen repeatedly. My mother leaned forward sharply. She said the system must have pulled Miles's information automatically because he used to help with bills years ago. She spoke directly to the guests now, not Daniel. Rebuilding the narrative, reasserting control. But the room had already begun to shift its attention. The guests were no longer looking at my parents for explanations. They were looking at the paperwork. Ava broke the tension again. Her voice was quiet but steady. She asked a question that seemed simple on the surface. If Miles had helped with the bills years ago, why were the accounts still under his name after he moved out? My father opened his mouth, closed it again. Then he said something about convenience. Switching accounts was complicated. People got busy. It never seemed urgent. The explanation floated weakly in the air, because the timeline on the report showed something different. One of the accounts had been opened 2 years after I left the house. Another had been opened last year, long after I had started the restaurant, long after I had stopped having any involvement with the house. Daniel noticed the same detail. He turned the page again and pointed to the most recent entry. A small credit line opened 18 months earlier, submitted online, approved within hours. He asked who had filled out that application. This time, the silence lasted longer. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin again. The cloth twisted slowly between her fingers. My father's face had begun to lose some of its practiced calm. He looked around the table, searching for support. But the guests were no longer looking at him with easy trust. They were looking at the timeline, at the signatures, at the quiet man from the compliance office who had stopped asking casual questions and started examining details. I reached forward and slid one more sheet out of the folder. This one was different. Not from the banks, from the property records office. House deed filing summary. My father's eyes snapped toward it immediately. He recognized the format. Anyone who has signed mortgage documents recognizes it. The report showed the ownership structure of the house. 3 names. My father, my mother, and mine. The same arrangement that had existed since I was 21. A legal strategy my father had once described as smart planning. At the time, he said it would help with taxes and inheritance issues. What he hadn't expected was that the arrangement also gave me access to property records, which meant something else. Any utilities tied to the property could be cross-referenced with the ownership filings. Daniel leaned closer again. He read the header, then the list of names. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Not surprise, recognition. Because property documentation changes the way financial responsibility is evaluated. My father spoke quickly. He said the deed structure was simply a technical formality, nothing important. Families arranged property that way all the time. Daniel nodded. He didn't disagree, but he turned back to the compliance report. And then he asked the question that shifted the room completely. If Miles was listed on the deed, why were the utility accounts opened separately under his identity instead of through the shared property structure? The question landed like a dropped glass because it exposed something my parents had not considered. When institutions investigate identity flags, they do not just look at the accounts, they look at the surrounding records, property filings, credit applications, authorization forms, timelines. Stories can contradict themselves. Paperwork rarely does. My father's breathing had become slightly louder now. My mother stared at the documents as if willing them to disappear. Around the table, the guests were no longer pretending to eat. Forks rested quietly on plates. Ava sat very still beside me. For years, she had tried to keep peace in this house. Tonight, she was watching the system finally collide with something it could not charm its way around. Daniel closed the folder gently, not dismissively, carefully, like someone sealing evidence. Then he looked directly at my father. His tone remained polite, but the words carried weight now. He said that if the account holder had not authorized the applications, the institutions involved would likely begin a formal review, which meant signatures would be examined. Records would be requested and questions would be asked. The phrase formal review settled over the table like cold air, because everyone understood what it meant. This was no longer a family argument. This was documentation. And documentation had just invited the outside world into the room. Part 7. For a long moment after Daniel said the words formal review, no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that arrives when a room full of people suddenly realizes the situation in front of them has crossed into territory that no amount of politeness can undo. The candles burned lower. Someone's chair creaked as they shifted their weight. But otherwise, the room held its breath. My father had always been a man who believed reputation could smooth over almost anything. His entire adult life had been built on that assumption. He shook hands with the right people, he hosted the right dinners, he told the right stories about family values and perseverance, and for decades, that had worked. Because reputation is powerful when there are no documents contradicting it. Now, there were documents. My father leaned forward again, this time resting both hands flat on the table. His fingers spread slightly against the wood, as if he needed the surface to steady himself. He forced a thin smile and looked toward Daniel. He said there must be some misunderstanding. That was the word he chose. Misunderstanding. Not mistake. Not error. Certainly not fraud. Just a misunderstanding. Daniel didn't challenge the word, but he didn't agree with it either. Instead, he did something subtle that changed the emotional center of the conversation. He turned toward me again. He asked the question that should have been asked first. Had I ever authorized anyone to open accounts under my name for this property? The room tilted slightly toward my answer. 20 people leaned into that moment, whether they realized it or not. My mother spoke before I could respond. Her voice was tight now, the warmth gone from it. She said, of course I had, years ago. Everyone remembered that. Miles had helped manage the house bills when he still lived here. It had been his responsibility for a time. She looked around the table, inviting agreement. Several guests nodded reflexively, because it sounded plausible, because it matched the old narrative. But Daniel had already read the timeline, and timelines have a way of eroding convenient memories. I finally spoke. My voice was calm, not defensive, just clear. I said I had never authorized any of those accounts. The sentence landed quietly, but the effect was immediate. A chair scraped loudly as someone at the far end of the table shifted position. My father's face changed. Not dramatically, but the practiced composure cracked just enough to reveal something underneath. Anger. Quick. Sharp. My mother leaned forward again. She said, I must have forgotten. People forget things all the time, especially when they're overwhelmed. Her eyes held mine as she said it. It was the same tactic she had used when I was 12, when 16, when 20. Reframe the memory, replace it with a more convenient one. Except now there were 20 witnesses listening and a compliance officer sitting 2 seats away. Daniel tapped the report lightly. He pointed to the signature comparison again. Then he looked back at me. He asked if the signatures on the applications were mine. I shook my head. No. That single word seemed to drain the last comfortable illusion from the room. Because now the narrative had a problem. If the signatures weren't mine, and the accounts were under my identity, then someone else had created them. And the only people connected to the property were sitting at this table. My father leaned back abruptly. His chair legs thudded softly against the floor. He said something about this conversation being inappropriate for a holiday dinner. He said the matter should be discussed privately later, but the word privately sounded weaker than it had earlier in the evening, because once documentation appears in front of witnesses, privacy becomes difficult to reclaim. Ava finally spoke again. She had been quiet for several minutes, watching the exchange with careful attention. Now she looked directly at our parents. Her voice carried none of the old hesitation. She asked a question that seemed almost gentle. When had they planned to tell Miles about the accounts? My mother's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. My father looked away from Ava entirely, which answered the question more clearly than any explanation could. Daniel observed the silence carefully. Then he asked something else, something even more precise. Had either of my parents signed the authorization forms themselves? The question hung there like a suspended weight, because answering it required choosing between two dangerous options: admitting involvement or denying knowledge. My father rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. He said the paperwork had been handled online. Systems were confusing. Sometimes things were filled out automatically. Sometimes someone clicked the wrong name. The explanation sounded increasingly fragile. Daniel listened patiently. Then he turned one more page in the report. The final section contained something my parents had not expected: the application metadata. Digital submissions leave trails, timestamps, IP locations, device identifiers. The report listed the originating network for the most recent credit application. The address matched this house. Exactly, the same house where we were now sitting. Daniel didn't need to say anything dramatic. He simply pointed to the line. My father saw it, my mother saw it, Ava saw it. Several guests leaned forward to read it themselves. The room shifted again, because the story about careless banks and confused paperwork had just collided with something very specific: an application submitted from this address, under my identity. 18 months ago. Daniel leaned back slowly. He folded his hands again, and then he said something that sounded almost sympathetic. He said situations like this often became complicated when families tried to solve financial pressures quietly, especially when someone assumed permission that had never been formally given. My father's chair scraped again. He stood halfway up, then sat back down. For the first time all evening, the control he had exercised over the narrative was completely gone. The room was no longer listening to him. The room was listening to the evidence. Ava turned toward me. Her voice was softer now, but there was a firmness to it that hadn't existed earlier that night. She asked if the banks had requested any follow-up yet. I nodded. Yes, they had, several of them, because identity verification flags are not gentle requests. They are warnings. And once they appear, institutions begin asking questions that families cannot answer with stories. Daniel glanced toward my father one more time. Then he said something that sounded almost like advice. If the accounts were truly unauthorized, the account holder would likely need to submit a formal statement, a statement that could trigger a full review, possibly across multiple institutions. The phrase "full review" settled over the table, because everyone understood what it meant. Lawyers, investigators, financial records, reputation. My father's entire life had been built on controlling the story people believed about him. But stories lose their power when the paperwork begins speaking for itself. And the paperwork in front of us had only just started talking. Part 8. For years, my father had believed that controlling the story meant controlling reality. It was a simple formula. Repeat the narrative often enough, in enough rooms, in front of enough people, and eventually the story became accepted as truth. The unreliable son, the patient parents, the family that had tried everything. In that version of events, I existed as a cautionary tale, a disappointment that could be discussed with sympathetic shakes of the head over dinners, just like this one. But narratives depend on a fragile condition, no competing evidence, and tonight evidence had arrived with a timeline. The room no longer felt like a dinner party. It felt like something else entirely, like the quiet moment before a hearing begins, when everyone realizes they are about to witness something irreversible. My father's hands had not moved from the edge of the table, his fingers pressed against the wood as though the table itself might slide away from him. My mother still sat upright, posture perfect, but the social warmth that had defined her earlier in the evening had vanished completely. Her eyes kept returning to the line Daniel had pointed out. Originating network, Sinclair residence. The phrase had become an anchor in the room. A fact, something stories could not soften. Daniel had not said anything further. Compliance officers understand something most people don't. Silence encourages information to reveal itself. The longer a room sits with a document, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend it doesn't exist. Around the table, guests shifted in their seats. One of the neighbors quietly set his napkin beside his plate. Another guest leaned toward the person next to her and whispered something too quiet to hear. No one was eating anymore. The pie had cooled. Ava broke the silence again, but this time she wasn't asking our parents anything. She turned toward Daniel. Her voice was calm, professional. She asked how serious identity verification flags usually were. Daniel answered carefully. He didn't look at my parents when he spoke. He looked at the document. He explained that when banks detected mismatched signatures combined with account activity tied to a different location than the account holder, the situation usually triggered a review process. Sometimes it ended quickly if authorization could be verified. But if authorization couldn't be verified, the institutions involved had legal obligations to investigate further. Legal obligations. The phrase was heavy because obligations meant the process didn't depend on family cooperation. It would happen whether anyone wanted it or not. My father shifted again. He leaned forward, voice sharper now. He said this was all being exaggerated. No one had intended anything improper. Families helped each other all the time. This kind of technical mistake shouldn't be turned into a spectacle. The word spectacle hung awkwardly in the air, because the spectacle had not come from the paperwork. It had come from the speech earlier in the evening, the speech about responsibility, about burdens, about the unreliable son. That performance had been meant to lock the narrative in place. Instead, it had created witnesses. Daniel finally looked up again. He met my father's eyes with quiet steadiness. Then he said something that sounded almost gentle. He said institutions rarely consider intent first. They consider authorization. My father opened his mouth again, but Ava spoke before he could. Her voice was different now. Not hesitant, not careful, direct. She asked the question that had clearly been forming in her mind for the past 10 minutes. Had our parents ever told me that the accounts existed? No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. Ava's eyes moved slowly from our mother to our father. Something in her expression hardened. For most of her life, she had been the one who believed the family could still be repaired with enough patience. Tonight, that belief was cracking. My mother finally spoke again, but the tone had shifted. Less performance, more urgency. She said they had only done what was necessary to keep the house stable. Bills had to be paid. Sometimes parents had to make difficult decisions, especially when their children weren't reliable. The sentence landed like a final attempt to reclaim the narrative. Several guests glanced at me again, waiting to see if I would react emotionally. That had always been the trap. Anger would have helped them, defensiveness would have helped them, but documentation rewards calm. I slid one more sheet from the folder, not a bank document, a letter, printed on official letterhead. Daniel recognized the format immediately. So did my father. My father's face changed the moment he saw the header, because the letter wasn't from a bank. It was from the property insurance provider. Insurance companies perform periodic ownership reviews when financial irregularities appear around a property. The letter explained that during a routine cross-reference check, The insurer had noticed outstanding utility accounts under the name of one of the listed property owners, me. And because my name was on the deed, the insurer had requested clarification about the financial responsibility structure connected to the property. In other words, the problem had already moved beyond banks. Now the property itself had entered the conversation. Daniel read the letter slowly. Then he set it down beside the compliance report. 2 documents now rested in the center of the table. 2 institutions, 2 timelines, 2 separate systems pointing to the same inconsistency. My father stared at them both. For the first time all evening, he seemed to understand something important. Reputation had no authority here. Institutions did not care how charming he was at dinner parties. They cared about signatures, about filings, about liability. A guest near the end of the table cleared his throat. He had known my father for nearly 20 years, but now he looked uncertain about what he was seeing. Ava spoke again. This time her voice was quiet enough that everyone had to lean slightly forward to hear it. She asked one final question. Had our parents expected Miles to be responsible for those debts if the banks collected them? My mother's eyes widened slightly. My father looked away again. Neither answered. But everyone in the room understood something now. If the accounts had remained undiscovered, if the banks had pursued payment, the responsibility would have landed on me, the unreliable son, the perfect explanation. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he said something that changed the emotional weight of the evening completely. He said identity investigations often moved quickly once multiple institutions became involved. Banks, insurance providers, property filings. Each system shared information with the others, which meant the timeline was already forming. And once timelines formed, the question of authorization became unavoidable. My father's voice came out quieter this time, almost strained. He asked what that process usually involved. Daniel answered without hesitation. Documentation review, signature analysis, recorded statements from the account holder, and, if necessary, interviews with anyone connected to the applications. Interviews. The word echoed across the table, because suddenly the Thanksgiving dinner had become something else entirely. Not a family gathering, but the first room full of witnesses. Part 9. The strange thing about witnesses is that most people never realize they have become one until it is too late to leave quietly. 10 minutes earlier, the guests at my parents' dining table had been attending a holiday dinner. Now they were sitting in a room where paperwork, timelines, and unanswered questions were slowly rearranging the reputation of a family they thought they understood. No one spoke for several seconds after Daniel mentioned interviews. The word had a legal gravity to it. It suggested documentation, state and official records. It suggested that whatever happened next would not remain confined to this dining room. My father leaned back in his chair again, but the movement looked less like confidence and more like someone trying to create distance from the center of the table, from the documents, from the timeline, from the line that connected this house's internet network to the account application. My mother finally reached for her glass of wine and took a slow sip. Her hand was steady, but the action felt calculated, as if she were trying to demonstrate that nothing here truly worried her. That performance had worked for decades, but the room had changed. People were no longer looking at my parents for cues on how to interpret the situation. They were looking at the paperwork, and the paperwork had begun telling a story my parents did not control. Daniel remained calm, almost relaxed in his chair, though his attention never drifted far from the documents. Compliance work teaches patience, but it also teaches something else. When a timeline begins to form, you allow it to reveal itself without interference. Ava broke the silence again, but this time she wasn't addressing my parents or Daniel. She looked directly at me. Her voice was softer now, but the question carried weight. She asked when I had first discovered the accounts. I told her the truth. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had arrived at the restaurant office. The banks had attempted to contact me before, but the notification had been redirected through a compliance review system once the signatures failed verification. Several people around the table exchanged glances. 3 weeks. That meant something important. It meant I had known about this before tonight. My father realized that immediately. His eyes locked onto me. For the first time that evening, there was something almost desperate in his voice when he spoke. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. The question hung in the air, but the answer was obvious. Because confronting them privately would have allowed the narrative to reset. Apologies could be negotiated, stories could be adjusted, blame could be redistributed. But here, in a room full of witnesses, the facts had nowhere to hide. I answered calmly. I said I needed time to review the documentation first. Daniel nodded slightly when he heard that. That was the correct response. Documentation first. Statements later. My mother leaned forward suddenly. Her voice sharpened. She said it was cruel to bring something like this up during a family dinner. Cruel. The word felt almost surreal. For years, the family narrative had depended on my supposed lack of responsibility, my supposed failures, my supposed financial instability. Now that documentation had appeared contradicting that story, the conversation itself had become the offense. A guest near the middle of the table, an older man who had attended church with my parents for years, cleared his throat. He spoke cautiously. He asked if perhaps there had simply been confusion about who was responsible for the accounts. The suggestion was well-intentioned. People prefer explanations that preserve the idea that everyone involved is reasonable. But Daniel shook his head slightly, not dismissively, just factually. He said confusion usually doesn't produce forged signatures. The word forged landed like a dropped plate. My father reacted immediately. He said that word was inappropriate. No one had forged anything. Mistakes had been made, maybe, but words like that suggested something far worse than the situation actually was. Daniel didn't argue. He simply turned the report toward the guests nearest him and pointed to the signature comparison again. The difference was clear, even to untrained eyes. The careful imitation, the unnatural angles, the hesitation in the pen strokes. Someone across the table whispered something under their breath. Ava watched our parents carefully. For most of her life, she had believed that if she just understood them well enough, she could explain their behavior in ways that kept the family together. Tonight, she was beginning to realize something else. Some actions cannot be explained without changing the entire story. My father's voice came again, quieter now. He said that even if the paperwork had been filled out incorrectly, it didn't mean anyone had intended harm. The accounts had paid for utilities that kept the house running, electricity, water, gas, basic things. It wasn't as if the money had been stolen. The argument sounded almost reasonable, until Ava asked the next question. If the accounts were meant to help the house, why were they opened under Miles's identity instead of their own? My father didn't answer. My mother didn't answer. Daniel looked down at the timeline again. Then he said something that made the room even quieter. He said, institutions often look for patterns when identity flags appear. Patterns of financial pressure, patterns of narrative framing, patterns of delayed disclosure. The phrase narrative framing caught several people's attention because everyone at this table had heard the story about me many times. The unreliable son, the burden, the financial problem. And suddenly, that narrative looked less like a truth and more like preparation. Preparation for explaining debts under my name. The room understood that now. My father rubbed his temples slowly. The confident host who had delivered the Thanksgiving toast earlier seemed to have disappeared entirely. In his place sat a man realizing that the story he had repeated for years might soon collide with something he could not negotiate away. Daniel closed the compliance report once more, but he didn't slide it back toward me. Instead, he left it in the center of the table where everyone could still see the header. He said that the next step, if I chose to proceed, would likely involve submitting a formal identity dispute to the banks. That would trigger document retrieval, application records, network logs, verification calls, everything tied to the accounts. Once that process started, it rarely stayed confined to one institution. Information spreads quickly through financial networks. My mother stared at the folder. Then she said something that revealed more than she intended. She asked whether it was truly necessary to involve the banks at all. Daniel looked at her carefully. Then he said something simple. That decision belonged to the account holder. Every head in the room turned toward me again. Because the scapegoat in the family narrative had suddenly become the only person with authority to determine what happened next. My father understood that too. And for the first time in my life, he looked at me not as the son he could manage, but as someone holding a decision he could not control. Across the table, Ava's voice came again, barely above a whisper. She asked the question no one else had been willing to say aloud yet. If Miles filed the dispute, what would happen to the house? Part 10, Ava's question didn't sound dramatic when she asked it, but it changed the center of gravity in the room. Until that moment, the conversation had been about accounts, about paperwork, about signatures and timelines and applications submitted from a network tied to this house. But the house itself had remained untouched in the discussion, like a silent observer watching the evening unfold around it. Now the house had entered the story. And once property becomes part of a financial investigation, the stakes change. My father heard it immediately. His head turned toward Ava so quickly, the movement felt almost mechanical. For years, Ava had been the one person in the family who didn't challenge him directly. She mediated. She softened things. She translated tension into something manageable. Tonight, she had asked the one question he did not want anyone thinking about. What would happen to the house? Daniel didn't answer right away. He folded his hands together again and looked toward the deed summary I had placed beside the compliance report. The document listed the ownership structure clearly. 3 names: my father, my mother, and mine. The arrangement had always been presented as something harmless, a practical strategy, tax efficiency, future inheritance planning. At the time, I had signed the paperwork without much thought. I was 21, fresh out of school, still believing that family decisions were meant to protect everyone involved. My father had explained that adding my name would strengthen the financial profile of the property. What he hadn't explained was how complicated things could become if financial obligations tied to the property were opened under my identity. Daniel finally spoke. His tone remained careful, measured. He said that when a property owner disputed financial accounts connected to a residence, institutions sometimes reviewed the broader structure surrounding that property: utility records, credit activity, insurance documentation, and if those records showed inconsistencies, additional reviews could follow. The room leaned closer to that explanation. Even the guests who had tried to remain neutral were now fully engaged, because houses mean something different in small communities. They represent stability, reputation, generations. My father's voice came out tight. He asked what kind of additional reviews Daniel meant. Daniel didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He simply described the process. If a formal identity dispute was filed, the banks would retrieve application data. The utility companies would review authorization records. If those records indicated that someone other than the account holder had opened the accounts, the institutions could reassign financial responsibility. But that wasn't the only concern, because the property itself had been listed as the service location for several of those accounts. And when service accounts become linked to identity disputes, property insurers sometimes review their coverage assessments, which meant the letter from the insurance company suddenly mattered much more than anyone had realized earlier in the evening. My mother leaned forward sharply. She asked what that meant for the house. Daniel answered honestly. It depended on the outcome of the review. If the institutions concluded that the accounts had been opened without authorization, the financial liability could shift. Debts might be reassigned. Insurance risk profiles could change. And if multiple institutions flagged the property simultaneously, it could affect refinancing options or coverage renewals. The words were technical, but the meaning was clear enough. Financial scrutiny had the potential to reach the house itself. My father's face had gone pale. For decades, he had treated the house as the center of his reputation, the place where every holiday dinner happened, the place where guests were invited to admire the stability of the Sinclair family. The house was part of the story, and now that story was intersecting with paperwork. One of the guests, a woman who had known my parents for years through community events, spoke hesitantly. She asked whether the matter could simply be settled by transferring the accounts properly now. Daniel looked at her with a sympathetic expression. Then he explained something most people didn't realize. Once an identity verification flag was raised, institutions rarely closed the issue quietly. The timeline had already been recorded, the signature comparisons already logged, multiple systems had already exchanged data. Correcting the accounts now would not erase the questions about how they had been opened in the first place. Across the table, Ava watched our parents carefully. She had grown up inside this house. Every childhood memory she had was tied to these rooms. But she also understood something the guests were only beginning to realize. If the banks pursued the matter, the consequences would not be limited to embarrassment. Financial responsibility could shift quickly once documentation entered the process. My father's voice came again, quieter than before. He asked Daniel what would happen if the account holder decided not to file the dispute. Daniel considered the question. Then he answered with the same calm professionalism he had maintained all evening. In that case, the institutions would likely assume the accounts were legitimate. The debts would remain under the account holder's name. Collections could continue through the normal channels. The implication landed immediately. If I stayed silent, the financial responsibility would remain mine, exactly as the system had been designed. My mother finally looked at me directly. The expression in her eyes had changed. The practiced social warmth was gone. In its place was something more calculating. She said families sometimes had to make difficult decisions to keep everything together. Sometimes sacrifices were necessary. The word sacrifices hung in the air like a quiet accusation. The guests understood what she meant. The son who had always been described as the problem could simply absorb this one more burden. That would keep the house stable, the narrative intact, the reputation preserved. Daniel didn't interrupt, he didn't argue. He simply looked at me again. Because legally, the decision belonged to one person now, the account holder, the name on the report, Miles Sinclair. Across the table, Ava exhaled slowly. Then she said something no one in the room expected to hear from her. She said that if the accounts had been opened without permission, the responsibility should not belong to Miles. The statement was quiet, but it broke something fundamental in the old family structure, because the peacemaker had just stepped outside her assigned role. My father stared at her as if he didn't recognize the person speaking. For years, Ava had been the bridge between him and the rest of the world. Tonight, she had chosen a side. The room felt the shift immediately. Ava turned toward me. Her voice was steady. She asked a simple question. Had I already prepared the dispute paperwork? The folder on the table contained the answer. 3 weeks of preparation. 3 weeks of reviewing documents. 3 weeks of waiting for the right moment. I slid another sheet from the folder. Not a bank report. Not a property record. A pre-filled identity dispute form. Daniel recognized it instantly. My father did too. And for the first time all night, the man who had controlled every story in this house realized something that had never happened before. The scapegoat in the family narrative had come to Thanksgiving with the ending already written. Part 11. The room felt smaller after the dispute form appeared. It wasn't the physical space that changed. The dining room was still the same long rectangle of polished wood floors and soft yellow lighting. The same framed family photos still lined the walls. The same candle flames still flickered along the center of the table. But the atmosphere had shifted. Before, the documents had been evidence. Now, they were decisions. The identity dispute form rested beside the compliance report, its header printed in the formal language of institutional procedure. Boxes filled, reference numbers attached, signature line empty. 3 weeks of preparation condensed into a single sheet of paper. Daniel glanced at it and immediately recognized the format. Compliance officers see these forms often enough to identify them at a glance. His eyes flicked over the sections. Account numbers listed, dispute type marked, identity verification request already prepared. He didn't say anything, but the subtle tightening in his expression confirmed something important. The form had been filled out correctly. Across the table, my father stared at the paper as if it had appeared from nowhere. The man who had delivered the Thanksgiving toast an hour earlier, the confident host explaining family loyalty and responsibility, had vanished completely. In his place sat someone trying to understand how control had slipped out of his hands so quickly. My mother spoke first. Her voice was quiet now, almost careful. She asked if I had truly planned to file the dispute. The phrasing mattered. Not why I had prepared it, but whether I intended to use it. The implication was obvious. There was still time to stop, still time to fold the paper back into the folder, still time to keep the story intact. Daniel remained silent. A compliance officer understands when the conversation has moved beyond procedure and into personal decisions. Ava didn't speak either. She simply watched me. For most of her life, she had tried to hold the family together by smoothing conflicts before they became permanent. Tonight, she understood that the conflict had already crossed that line. I looked at the form again. 3 weeks earlier, when the envelope from the bank arrived, I had opened it expecting something routine, maybe a verification notice, maybe a credit alert. Instead, I had found a list of accounts I had never opened. At first, the discovery hadn't made me angry. It had made me tired, because it confirmed something I had suspected for years. In this family, narratives were tools, and sometimes those tools required someone else's name on the paperwork. My father leaned forward suddenly. His voice had regained a small edge of authority. He said there was no need for this to go further. Whatever confusion existed could be sorted out inside the family. The banks didn't need to become involved. He spoke the words like instructions, like the situation could still be corrected through persuasion. But the room had already changed, because persuasion depends on influence, and influence weakens when evidence appears. Daniel finally spoke again. His voice remained neutral. He said identity disputes were designed specifically for situations where internal resolution wasn't possible. The account holder had the legal right to challenge unauthorized applications. Institutions expected that process. My mother turned toward him sharply. She asked whether filing the form automatically triggered investigations. Daniel answered honestly. Often, yes. Banks retrieved application records, digital logs, recorded calls if any had occurred during verification. Utility companies reviewed account activation requests. If multiple institutions were involved, their findings were often shared. The phrase shared findings carried quiet weight because it meant the timeline could expand beyond a single account, beyond a single bank, beyond a single story. My father exhaled slowly. Then he tried a different approach. He leaned toward me, his voice softened, almost paternal. He said families sometimes made decisions under pressure. The house had required maintenance, bills had accumulated. At the time, using my name had seemed like the easiest way to keep everything stable. The admission was subtle, carefully worded. But the guests heard it. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. Ava heard it too. Her eyes widened slightly, because my father had just acknowledged the central fact of the evening. The accounts had been opened deliberately, not accidentally. Daniel noticed it as well. Compliance officers are trained to recognize partial admissions. But he didn't comment. Not here. Not at a dinner table. My mother reacted immediately. She shook her head slightly as if correcting the conversation. She said what my father meant was that everyone had been helping each other at the time. It had been a family arrangement, not something done behind anyone's back. Her eyes flicked toward me when she said it, but the problem with that explanation had already been established. No authorization, no signatures, no conversation. Ava finally spoke again. Her voice was very quiet, but the question carried through the room clearly. She asked whether they had ever planned to tell me. Neither parent answered. That silence became the loudest moment of the evening. The guests understood what it meant. For years, they had heard stories about the difficult son, the irresponsible one, the one who had forced his parents to carry extra burdens. Now the timeline suggested something different. That narrative might have been necessary to explain debts that had been placed under his name. Daniel looked back at the dispute form. Then he looked at me. He didn't give advice. He didn't suggest what I should do. He simply explained one final piece of information. If the dispute was filed, the banks would likely freeze collection actions on the accounts while the review took place. But the investigation would move quickly. Statements would be requested, documentation collected, and eventually someone would have to explain how the applications had been submitted. Across the table, my father's shoulders sagged slightly. The realization had reached him now. The story he had told earlier in the evening, the one about responsibility and sacrifice, had created the perfect stage for what came next, because the guests sitting around the table had heard both versions, the narrative and the evidence. Ava leaned back slowly in her chair. Her eyes moved between the documents and our parents. Then she said something that shifted the emotional center of the room one more time. She said that if the banks started asking questions, the truth would eventually become public anyway, which meant the only real question left was how long the story had been built on a lie. My father closed his eyes briefly, just for a second. Then he opened them again and looked directly at me. For the first time all night, there was no performance in his voice. Only calculation. He asked what it would take for me not to file the form. Part 12. The question changed the tone of the room more than anything that had been said all night. What would it take? My father had stopped pretending the accounts were misunderstandings. He had stopped insisting the banks were confused. He had stopped trying to rebuild the old narrative about irresponsible children and patient parents. Now he was negotiating. And everyone at the table understood it. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Negotiation only happens when someone realizes they no longer control the story. The candles had burned lower. Wax pooled around their bases, the flames shorter now, softer. The room had grown warmer from too many bodies sitting too still for too long, yet the air carried a tension sharp enough to make the back of my neck feel cool. My mother looked at my father immediately after he asked the question. Her expression flashed with surprise for half a second, as if she hadn't expected him to move so quickly into that territory. But she recovered almost instantly. She turned toward me with a measured calm. She said families sometimes found ways to resolve things privately when emotions cooled down. That was the language she preferred. Private resolution. Cooling emotions. Careful phrases that avoided the obvious fact that the accounts had been opened under my name without permission. Daniel watched the exchange quietly. Compliance officers learn early in their careers that negotiations like this often begin when people finally understand how documentation works. Once records exist, the only remaining leverage comes from convincing the affected party not to use them. Ava noticed it too. Her eyes moved slowly from my father to me. For most of her life, she had been the one who helped restore balance when conversations between us became tense. Tonight she said nothing, because balance had already shifted. My father leaned forward again. His voice had lost the commanding tone from earlier in the evening. Now it carried something closer to urgency. He said the house had been under financial pressure for years. Repairs, insurance adjustments after the storm seasons, unexpected expenses. Sometimes families used whatever tools they had to keep everything afloat. The word tools hung strangely in the air, because tools usually don't include someone else's identity. One of the guests, a neighbor who had attended dozens of these dinners over the years, cleared his throat gently. He looked uncomfortable. For the first time all evening, he spoke with cautious honesty. He said that if the accounts had been opened without permission, the matter seemed serious, regardless of the financial stress involved. The room absorbed that comment quietly. It was the first time anyone outside the immediate family had acknowledged the core issue directly. My mother gave the neighbor a tight smile, the kind meant to smooth over awkward remarks. But the smoothing no longer worked. Daniel finally spoke again. His tone remained calm, professional. He explained that financial pressure was not unusual in cases like this, but institutions still required authorization for identity use, even within families, especially within families. My father rubbed his hands together slowly. He looked tired now, older than he had an hour earlier. Then he turned back toward me. He asked again, more plainly this time. What would it take? The room leaned toward the answer, because everyone understood something important now. For years, my father had been the one who determined the conditions of every family conflict. Tonight, the leverage had reversed. The scapegoat in the narrative had become decision maker. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I glanced at the dispute form resting on the table. 3 weeks earlier, when I first printed it, the paper had felt like preparation. Now it felt like closure, waiting for a signature. Ava watched me carefully. She understood the weight of the moment more clearly than anyone else at the table, because she had lived inside the same system. The system that required one person to absorb blame so the rest of the family could appear stable. The system that depended on silence. My mother spoke again, her voice gentler now. She said everyone in the room cared about family, that sometimes forgiveness mattered more than paperwork. The word forgiveness moved through the air like a quiet plea. But forgiveness requires acknowledgement first, and acknowledgement had not arrived. Daniel glanced briefly toward the dispute form, then back toward me. He didn't interrupt the conversation, but his presence reminded everyone that the situation had already extended beyond the walls of this house. The compliance report existed, the insurance letter existed. Multiple institutions had already logged the irregularities. The process had already begun. Across the table, Ava finally spoke. Her voice was calm. She asked our parents whether they planned to repay the accounts themselves if the dispute wasn't filed. My father hesitated. The pause lasted only a second, but in negotiations, hesitation is information. My mother answered instead. She said they would work something out, eventually. The vagueness of that answer spread slowly through the room. Eventually did not mean responsibility. Eventually meant delay. Daniel noticed it. So did the guests. The narrative that had been presented earlier in the evening, the one about responsible parents managing burdens created by an unreliable son, now looked fragile, because the supposed burden had come from accounts opened under the son's identity. My father leaned back in his chair again. The movement seemed to drain some of the last certainty from his posture. Then he said something quieter, almost reflective. He said he had spent his whole life building the family reputation in this town, the house, the community involvement, the dinners, everything people saw when they thought of the Sinclair name. The statement wasn't an apology, it was a reminder. Reputation had always been his strongest currency. But tonight the room had learned something about currency. Reputation only works until documentation arrives. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked one more question. If the reputation mattered that much, why risk it by using Miles's identity? The question landed with a quiet finality, because it stripped away the last layer of justification. My father did not answer. My mother did not answer. Across the table, Daniel exhaled softly. Then he looked toward me again. The decision still belonged to the account holder. The form lay on the table, the signature line blank. 20 witnesses in the room, and the story of the Sinclair family standing at a point where one signature could determine how the truth would leave the house. Part 13. My father's question still hung in the air. What would it take? For years, the structure of this family had been built on a simple assumption. Eventually, I would give in. Eventually, I would absorb whatever accusation or inconvenience had been placed on my shoulders. Eventually, the story would reset to its usual shape. But negotiations only work when both sides believe the other person needs something. Tonight, that assumption had cracked. The compliance report lay open on the table, the insurance letter rested beside it, and the dispute form waited quietly for a signature. 3 documents, 3 institutions, 3 pieces of evidence that did not care about family reputation. The guests sitting around the table had become very still. Some leaned forward slightly, elbows near their plates. Others sat back, arms crossed, watching the exchange with the quiet fascination people feel when they realize they are witnessing the collapse of something long believed to be stable. My father's eyes had not left me. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty there. Not the theatrical disappointment he had used for years when describing me to others. Real uncertainty. My mother tried once more to soften the moment. She said families sometimes reached points where everyone had to decide whether they wanted peace or conflict. Peace. The word drifted across the table like a familiar refrain. But peace in our family had always meant something very specific. Silence. Acceptance. Allowing the story to remain unchanged. Ava shifted slightly in her chair. She understood that too. For years, she had worked hard to maintain that version of peace. She had explained my father's temper, interpreted my mother's criticisms as concern, translated accusations into misunderstandings. Tonight, she seemed to be seeing those efforts from a different angle. Daniel watched quietly. He had stopped touching the paperwork altogether now. Compliance officers understand when a decision has moved beyond institutional procedure into personal territory. But his presence mattered. Because everyone in the room knew that if the dispute form left the house tonight, the institutions behind those documents would begin asking questions no family narrative could answer. I finally spoke. My voice was calm. I said there were 2 separate issues, the accounts and the story. Several guests exchanged small glances. My father frowned slightly. He asked what I meant. I tapped the compliance report lightly. These accounts existed. They were opened under my name, and they had accumulated debt. That part was simple. Documentation made it simple. The story, however, was something else. For years, my parents had described me as irresponsible, financially unstable, a burden on the family. That story had been repeated often enough that people around this table believed it. Several guests shifted uncomfortably when I said that, because they recognized themselves in that description. They had heard the speeches, the sympathetic sighs, the careful anecdotes about difficult children. My father spoke quickly. He said the past wasn't relevant to the current situation. The accounts were the issue now. But the past was exactly why the accounts had worked. I said that quietly, because the narrative about me had created the perfect explanation if the debts were ever discovered. Miles must have opened them. Miles always had trouble managing money. Miles probably forgot. The room absorbed that logic slowly. Ava looked down at the table, then back at our parents. Something about the timeline was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel spoke gently. He said narratives sometimes influenced how financial irregularities were interpreted. It was an academic observation, but everyone understood the implication. My father rubbed his forehead slowly. Then he looked at me again. His voice was quieter now. He said mistakes had been made. The words felt heavy, not quite an apology, but the closest he had come all evening. My mother looked at him sharply. She had not expected that. Acknowledging mistakes meant the narrative could not be restored exactly as it had been before. Across the table, Ava inhaled slowly. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. Because hearing those words changed something, even if they were incomplete. My father continued speaking. He said the accounts had been opened during a difficult period. The house needed repairs. Storm damage had created unexpected costs. Insurance delays had complicated things. At the time, using my identity had seemed like a temporary solution. Temporary. The word echoed quietly in the room. Because the timeline on the report showed 4 years of accounts. Daniel noticed it too, but he didn't interrupt. He let the explanation finish. My father leaned forward slightly. His voice carried a hint of desperation now. He said filing the dispute would create consequences none of them could control. Investigations, public records, community attention, the Sinclair name appearing in places it had never appeared before. Reputation again. That had always been the center of his world. Across the table, one of the guests, an older woman who had attended nearly every holiday dinner here for decades, spoke softly. She said reputations were strongest when people faced their mistakes honestly. No one responded to her, but the sentence remained in the air. My mother's gaze returned to the dispute form. Her voice came out low. She said once that form was filed, the situation could never return to normal. I nodded. That was true. Daniel confirmed it quietly. Institutions recorded everything. Disputes became part of permanent documentation. Timelines, statements, official conclusions. There was no way to erase that process once it began. My father looked around the table. He saw the guests, the witnesses, people who had listened to the Thanksgiving toast earlier in the evening, people who had heard the speech about responsibility, and now people who had seen the documentation contradicting it. The room had become something he could not manage. Ava leaned toward me slightly. Her voice was soft, but the words were firm. She said that whatever happened next, the truth should not remain hidden. For most of her life, she had tried to protect our parents from embarrassment. Tonight, she had stopped. My father looked at her with something like disbelief. Then he looked back at me. The calculation in his eyes returned. He understood now that the decision did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the person whose name appeared on every account. Miles Sinclair. The son described for years as unreliable. The son who had quietly built a restaurant 2 miles from the French Quarter. The son who had spent 3 weeks gathering documentation before coming to Thanksgiving dinner. My father's voice came one last time. Quiet, measured. He asked whether I truly intended to destroy the family over paperwork. The room waited, because everyone understood something important now. The story of the Sinclair family had reached a point where only one question remained. Not whether the paperwork was real, but whether the truth inside it would finally be allowed to leave the room. Part 14. The word destroy lingered in the air longer than anything else that had been said that night. It was a powerful word, dramatic, heavy with implication. My father had always known how to choose language that redirected responsibility. It was one of his quiet talents. When something went wrong, the focus shifted from the action itself to the reaction. The problem was never the act. The problem was the person who exposed it. Destroy the family over paperwork. The phrasing tried to turn the dispute form into an act of aggression rather than a response to something that had already happened. Several guests shifted uncomfortably when he said it, because the sentence asked them to make a decision inside their own heads, whether the real disruption had been the accounts or the person bringing them into the light. Daniel didn't move. A compliance officer hears that kind of framing often when financial records collide with personal relationships. He simply watched the table, letting the words settle where they would. My mother reached slowly for her glass again, but didn't drink this time. Her fingers rested against the stem, turning it slightly back and forth against the polished wood. Her eyes stayed on the dispute form. The signature line, still empty. Ava exhaled quietly. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. She said something that shifted the emotional direction of the room. She said the family had already been damaged long before tonight. The room absorbed that sentence slowly, because it carried the weight of years. My father turned toward her immediately. His expression held a mixture of shock and disbelief. For decades, Ava had been the person who preserved the appearance of harmony, the one who explained his behavior to others, yet softened my mother's criticisms, encouraged me to be patient when conflicts flared. Now she was acknowledging something different, that the damage had not begun with a piece of paper. My mother spoke quickly. She said, Ava didn't understand the pressures the family had faced. The house, the bills, the expectations of the community. Sometimes difficult decisions had to be made quietly. Ava nodded slightly, but her next sentence cut through that explanation with calm precision. She said, difficult decisions usually involve telling the person whose name was being used. A murmur moved through the guests. It was subtle, just a low ripple of agreement, but it changed the atmosphere again, because the peacemaker in the family had just stated the obvious truth in a room where everyone could hear it. Daniel glanced briefly at the dispute form again, then back at me. He still hadn't given advice, but his presence had become something else. A witness from the outside world. My father leaned forward suddenly. His voice was sharper again. He said the banks didn't need to know about every family arrangement. People handled these things privately all the time. But the problem with that argument had already been established. The banks already knew. That was why the compliance report existed. That was why the insurance letter had arrived. The systems had already detected irregularities. The institutions were already watching the timeline. I said that quietly, not as an accusation, just a fact. My father closed his mouth. For the first time all evening, he had no immediate response. My mother's eyes moved from me to the guests around the table. She understood something important now. The room had become a jury of reputation. People who had heard the family story for years. People who had trusted it. And now people who were seeing the paperwork contradict it. One of the guests, a quiet man who ran a hardware store down the street, spoke carefully. He said everyone respected the Sinclair family in this neighborhood, but respect depended on honesty. The statement was gentle, but its meaning was unmistakable. My father's shoulders stiffened. The word honesty struck directly at the center of the identity he had built. Daniel leaned slightly forward, not to intervene, but to clarify something. He said once an identity verification flag appeared across multiple institutions, the process rarely stopped on its own. Even if the dispute form wasn't filed tonight, the banks might continue asking questions. Documentation had already been exchanged. The timeline had already been recorded. My mother looked sharply at him. She asked if that meant the investigation could happen even without my involvement. Daniel answered honestly, sometimes. Especially when insurance providers became involved, which meant the letter sitting on the table mattered even more than it had earlier. The room fell quiet again, because suddenly the decision wasn't simply about whether to expose the truth. The truth might already be moving on its own. Ava looked at the dispute form, then at our parents, then at me. Her voice softened, but the firmness remained. She said something that sounded almost like an observation rather than a challenge. She said the problem wasn't the paperwork. The problem was that the paperwork told the truth, and the truth didn't match the story the family had been telling. My father rubbed his eyes slowly. The gesture made him look older than he had at the beginning of the evening. When he lowered his hands again, he spoke more quietly, almost reflective. He said families sometimes survived because people chose forgiveness instead of accountability. The sentence sounded rehearsed, like something he had believed his entire life. Across the table, Ava shook her head slightly. She said forgiveness and accountability weren't opposites, but forgiveness usually came after the truth. The room held that thought carefully. Daniel remained silent. The guests remained silent. Even my mother said nothing. My father finally looked back at the dispute form, then at me, and in a voice stripped of performance, he asked the question that had been building all night. If you file that form, what happens to us? The room leaned toward the answer, because the next decision would determine not only the future of the accounts, but the moment when the Sinclair family story finally left the protection of its own dining room. Part 15. The question stayed in the air long enough for everyone at the table to feel the weight of it. What happens to us? For years, my father had spoken about the family as if it were a single structure, something solid and unified, something that could only survive if everyone inside it accepted the same version of events. But the documents on the table had already revealed something different. The family had not been one structure. It had been a system, and like most systems, it depended on someone absorbing the pressure so the rest could appear stable. The scapegoat, the unreliable son. The story had worked because it had been repeated so often that people stopped questioning it. Now the paperwork was doing something narratives cannot do. It was measuring responsibility. Daniel sat quietly with his hands folded, watching the room carefully. Compliance officers develop a habit of observing human reactions as closely as they observe documents. Tonight, both were revealing the same thing. The timeline was stronger than the story. Ava looked from my father to me again. The silence had stretched long enough that even the guests began shifting in their seats. Someone near the end of the table finally picked up their glass and took a sip of water, the small movement sounding unusually loud in the quiet room. My mother spoke first. Her voice carried something new now, not anger, concern. She said families survive difficult moments when people chose understanding instead of punishment. Punishment. The word slid into the conversation like a defensive shield. Because if the dispute form was punishment, then the original action could remain framed as necessity. But Daniel spoke before the idea could settle. His voice remained steady. He said identity disputes were not punishments. They were corrections. The room absorbed that quietly. Corrections. A simple word, but one that shifted the moral center of the conversation. My father leaned forward again. His hands rested on the edge of the table like they had earlier, but now the posture looked less like control and more like someone bracing himself. He said investigations created consequences that extended beyond paperwork, community attention, financial scrutiny, public records. The Sinclair name appearing in places it had never appeared before. He looked around the table while saying it, at the neighbors, the church friends, the business associates, the witnesses. Reputation again, always reputation. But the guests were no longer responding to that argument the way they had earlier in the evening, because the reputation they had believed in had just collided with documentation. Ava leaned forward slightly. Her voice was quiet but clear. She asked a question that redirected the entire conversation. What would have happened if Miles had never discovered the accounts? No one answered immediately. But the answer existed inside the compliance report. Collections would have continued. Debt would have grown. Eventually, the financial responsibility would have reached the account holder. Miles Sinclair. The unreliable son. The perfect explanation. Daniel finally spoke again. He said institutions rarely looked at narratives when assigning responsibility. They looked at the name on the account. My father closed his eyes briefly, just for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked directly at me, and something in his expression had changed. The performance was gone now. The confident host, the storyteller, the man who controlled the narrative of every room he entered. In his place sat someone confronting a situation he could not negotiate away. He spoke slowly. He said if the dispute was filed, investigators would ask questions about the applications, who submitted them, who accessed the network, who signed the forms. Daniel nodded slightly. That was correct. My father exhaled. Then he asked something else, something he had not asked all evening. Would the investigation reach the property records? Daniel hesitated just slightly before answering. Possibly, especially if the financial liability became tied to the property ownership structure. The deed summary lay beside the report, 3 names, 3 owners. My father looked at it again, then back at me. For decades, he had believed the structure of the house protected the family. Now he was beginning to understand that structure also created accountability. My mother leaned toward him quickly. Her voice came out in a low whisper, meant only for him, but the quiet room carried it further than she expected. She said this didn't have to happen. The words landed across the table like a plea. Because now everyone understood something important. The dispute form was not simply paperwork. It was a decision about whether the truth would remain inside the family system or move into the institutions that recorded facts. Ava spoke again. Her voice sounded steadier than it had all evening. She said something that seemed simple but carried enormous weight. She said the truth had already arrived. The room held that thought carefully. Because it was true. The compliance report existed. The insurance letter existed. The timeline had already been documented. Filing the dispute would not create the truth. It would simply allow it to move forward. My father looked around the table once more. He saw the faces of people who had trusted him for years. People who had listened to the Thanksgiving toast earlier that evening. People who had believed the story about the difficult son. Now those same people had read the documents. The narrative had cracked. My father's voice came again, quiet, almost resigned. He said investigations would ask for statements, recorded ones. Daniel nodded. That was standard procedure. My father looked back at me. For the first time all night, there was no strategy left in his expression. Only the realization that the moment he had spent years avoiding had finally arrived. He asked one final question. If you sign that form, are you prepared for everything that follows? The room waited, because the answer would determine whether the Sinclair family story ended quietly inside this dining room or began a much larger chapter beyond it. Part 16. The room had reached a point where even the smallest movement felt significant. Someone shifted a chair. A glass touched the table with a soft tap. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding briefly across the curtains before disappearing again. Inside the dining room, 20 people waited for an answer. My father's question still hung there. Are you prepared for everything that follows? It was not a threat. Not exactly. It was a statement about consequences, investigations, records, statements. The Sinclair name appearing in official places it had never appeared before. For a man who had spent his life protecting the family image, that possibility felt catastrophic. Daniel remained perfectly still, his attention balanced between me and the paperwork on the table. Compliance officers are trained to watch for the moment when a situation becomes irreversible. He understood this was that moment. Ava's gaze hadn't left my face. Her expression held something different now. Not anxiety, not fear. Something closer to clarity. Because she understood something our parents had spent years avoiding. The story had already changed. The only question left was whether it would change publicly. My mother spoke again. Her voice had softened. The sharp edges from earlier had faded into something that almost sounded like exhaustion. She said families sometimes survived by choosing mercy. Mercy. Another word designed to reshape the narrative. Because if I filed the dispute, the story could become about harshness, about revenge, about destroying the family. But the compliance report sitting on the table didn't use words like mercy. It used words like authorization, verification, liability. My father leaned forward again. The candles lit the lines in his face differently now. He looked older than he had at the beginning of the evening. He said the house had always been the center of the family, the place where every holiday happened, the place where people gathered, where the Sinclair name meant something. His voice lowered, almost reflective. He said once investigations started, that stability could disappear quickly. Banks asking questions, insurance reviews, community gossip, the kind of attention that spreads through a town faster than anyone expects. Across the table, one of the guests, a business associate of my father's, shifted uncomfortably. He had listened quietly all evening. Now he spoke. His voice carried a cautious honesty. He said the attention would not come from the dispute. It would come from the accounts. The room absorbed that correction slowly, because it moved the responsibility back to where the timeline pointed. Daniel glanced briefly toward the man and gave a small nod. Then he returned his attention to me. Ava leaned back slightly. She looked around the table at the guests who had heard the Thanksgiving speech earlier in the evening. Then she looked at the documents again. Her voice came softly. She said the story about Miles had always depended on people believing he caused the problems. Now the paperwork showed something different. My mother closed her eyes briefly, just for a moment. When she opened them again, the social composure she had maintained for decades seemed thinner. She said every family made mistakes, but exposing them to outsiders could destroy things that never came back. The sentence drifted across the table like a warning. Daniel did not challenge it, but he added something quietly. Sometimes things were already broken before the paperwork arrived. The silence that followed was deeper than any earlier in the evening, because everyone understood what he meant. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. He looked around the room again, at the guests, the witnesses, the people who had spent years hearing the Sinclair family story, the story where I had always been the difficult one. Then he looked back at the dispute form, the single blank line waiting at the bottom. Signature of account holder. My name already printed above it, Miles Sinclair. The son who had been described for years as unreliable. The son who had come to Thanksgiving dinner with 3 weeks of documentation. My father's voice returned one last time. Quiet. He said if the dispute was filed, investigators would look at everything. Bank logs, network records, property ownership, statements from everyone connected to the applications. Daniel nodded once. That was exactly how the process worked. My father exhaled slowly. Then he looked directly at me, not as the host of the evening, not as the storyteller controlling the narrative, but as someone finally recognizing where the authority now rested. He said if the investigation confirmed the accounts had been opened without authorization, the responsibility would shift. The debts, the liability, the scrutiny, the weight that had been sitting quietly under my name for 4 years. Daniel answered the unspoken part of the sentence. Yes, that was exactly what would happen. The room felt different now, not tense in the way it had been earlier, more like the quiet space before a decision is made. Ava looked at the dispute form again, then at me. Her voice was calm. She said something that sounded almost like closure. She said the truth had waited long enough. Across the table, my mother's fingers tightened around the edge of her napkin. My father stared at the blank signature line. 20 people in the room, 3 institutions already involved, a timeline that had finally caught up with the story. I picked up the pen. The small movement pulled every eye in the room toward the table. Daniel didn't move. Ava didn't breathe. My father watched the paper as if the next few seconds might decide the future of everything he had built. The pen hovered over the line, and in that moment the story of the Sinclair family stood balanced between 2 outcomes: the version that had survived for years inside this house, and the version that would exist once the truth left it. Part 17. The pen felt heavier than it should have. It was an ordinary pen, nothing special, the same kind my mother kept in a ceramic holder near the kitchen phone for grocery lists and reminder notes. But in that moment, it carried the quiet weight of years. The room had stopped breathing. No one moved. Even the candle flames seemed still. 20 people watched the space between the pen and the paper, as if time itself had narrowed to that single line. Signature of account holder, Miles Sinclair. My father stared at the form with an intensity I had never seen from him before. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to disbelief. Because for most of his life, control had been invisible to him. It existed simply because the family structure allowed it. He told the story, and everyone around him behaved according to it. But stories depend on repetition, and repetition depends on cooperation. Tonight, the cooperation had ended. My mother leaned forward suddenly. Her voice came out softer than it had been all evening. Miles. She rarely used my name that way, carefully, almost like a request. She said that once the form was signed, there would be no quiet resolution afterward. Investigators would contact the banks. Statements would be requested. Neighbors would talk. The Sinclair name would appear in records people could access. Her eyes moved briefly toward the guests sitting around the table. Not accusations, just reminders. Reputation again, the currency my parents had always valued most. Daniel watched the exchange without interrupting. Compliance officers understand when a conversation has reached its final phase. There's always a moment when persuasion ends and consequences begin. Ava finally spoke. Her voice was steady. She said something that changed the emotional direction of the room again. She said the reputation had already changed tonight. The guests felt that sentence. Several of them shifted slightly in their chairs because they knew it was true. They had arrived believing one version of the Sinclair family story. Now they had seen the documents, the compliance report, the insurance letter, the dispute form. Stories lose their power once evidence appears beside them. My father rubbed his forehead slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, he looked defeated. The confident host from earlier, the man who had delivered the Thanksgiving toast, seemed like someone from a different night. He said something quietly, almost to himself. He said the house had always been meant to protect the family. The house, the center of every holiday, the place where reputation lived. Daniel glanced briefly toward the deed summary again, then back toward the table. Because that house had also created the trail of documentation connecting everything together. My mother looked at the pen in my hand. Her voice came again, but this time it carried something fragile. She asked if there was still a way to resolve the accounts without the dispute. Daniel answered gently. The institutions had already flagged the accounts. Without a dispute, the debts would remain under the account holder's name. The room understood that. Silence meant responsibility. Responsibility meant Miles. The narrative my parents had built for years would quietly remain intact. My father finally looked back at me. His voice came low. He said if the form was signed, there would be consequences none of them could control. The investigation could reach further than anyone expected. Financial reviews, questions about the house, questions about the accounts, questions about how the signatures appeared. Daniel didn't contradict him. That was exactly how these processes worked. Ava leaned forward slightly. She looked at our parents for a long moment. Then she said something that seemed simple, but carried enormous meaning. She said the consequences had already existed. They had just been sitting under someone else's name. The sentence landed softly, but it settled into the room like truth finally finding a place to stand. My father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he looked older, tired. He looked at the guests around the table, people who had trusted his version of the family story for years, people who now knew something different. Then he looked back at the form. The pen hovered above the signature line. The room leaned toward the decision. Ava's hand rested quietly on the table. Daniel's posture remained calm. My mother's fingers twisted slowly in her napkin. My father stared at the paper as if watching the final moment of a story he had spent decades writing. I lowered the pen. The tip touched the paper. And in the quiet dining room where the Sinclair family narrative had lived for so many years, I wrote my name, Miles Sinclair. The sound of the pen moving across the paper was barely audible, but it was enough, because once the signature existed, the story inside this house no longer belonged to the family alone. Daniel looked down at the form. He nodded slowly. The dispute was official. Across the table, my father didn't speak. My mother didn't move. Ava exhaled softly. 20 witnesses sat in the room where the narrative had finally broken. But the signature on the paper had done something more important than end the old story. It had begun a new one. And outside the house, institutions that cared more about signatures than stories were already waiting to read it. Part 18. For several seconds after the pen left the paper, no one moved. The act itself had been quiet. No dramatic gesture, no raised voices, no sudden confrontation, just the steady motion of ink across a line that had been waiting for a name. But everyone in the room understood what had just happened. The story that had lived inside this house for years had crossed a boundary. Now it belonged to institutions. Daniel was the first person to move. Not dramatically. He simply leaned forward and looked at the signed form with the calm focus of someone used to documents that change timelines. His eyes scanned the bottom line, verifying the signature matched the identification sample on the compliance report. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod professionals give when a process has officially begun. The dispute was no longer hypothetical. Across the table, Ava let out a slow breath she had been holding for several minutes. Her shoulders lowered slightly, as though a tension she had carried for years had finally been acknowledged. My father remained completely still. His eyes were fixed on the paper. Not the entire form, just the signature. Miles Sinclair. He had spent years constructing a version of that name that carried blame, carelessness, instability, a son whose actions created burdens for the rest of the family. Now the same name had triggered something he could not control. My mother's fingers were still twisted tightly in her napkin. She looked at Daniel. Her voice came out very carefully. "What happens now?" Daniel answered without hesitation. The dispute would be submitted to the institutions listed in the report. Once received, the banks would retrieve the application records connected to the accounts. Utility companies would review the authorization data used to open their services. If the signatures failed verification, as the preliminary report already suggested, they would begin determining who had submitted the applications. He spoke in the calm, procedural language of someone describing a process that occurred every day. But inside this room, the words carried enormous weight, because everyone understood the implications. Network logs, application timestamps, verification steps, records of who accessed the forms. Paper trails have a way of reconstructing moments people hoped would remain private. My father finally leaned back in his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, like someone absorbing the reality of a situation they could no longer negotiate. He looked at the documents again, the compliance report, the insurance letter, the signed dispute form. 3 pieces of paper that had dismantled a story built over decades. My mother spoke again. Her voice was quieter now, almost fragile. She asked how long investigations like this usually took. Daniel answered honestly, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer, but the first steps moved quickly. Institutions typically froze collection activity while the identity dispute was reviewed. That meant the debts attached to the accounts would stop moving forward temporarily. But the investigation itself would begin almost immediately. He paused slightly before adding something else. Statements would eventually be requested from the account holder and from anyone connected to the property where the applications originated. The room understood that, because the network data on the report already pointed to one location, this house. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably. Another leaned toward their spouse and whispered something under their breath. The dinner party atmosphere had evaporated completely. In its place sat something more serious. A moment people would remember long after tonight. Ava looked at our parents. Her voice came gently. She said something that sounded almost compassionate. The truth was going to move forward now, whether anyone liked it or not. The paperwork had already started that process. My father closed his eyes again briefly. When he opened them, he looked at me, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something closer to recognition. For the first time in my life, he was looking at me as someone who had acted with authority he could not override. He spoke quietly. He said, "Investigations ask questions that spread further than people expect." Daniel nodded slightly. Financial reviews often expand once multiple institutions become involved. Banks communicate with insurance providers. Insurance providers review property records. Property records connect ownership structures. Timelines widen. Stories become less important than documentation. My mother's gaze drifted toward the guests sitting around the table. For years, these dinners had reinforced the Sinclair family narrative. Tonight, the same room had witnessed its collapse. Ava stood slowly, not abruptly, just enough to stretch her legs after sitting so long. She walked toward the window and looked out into the quiet New Orleans street. The neighborhood lights reflected faintly on the glass. After a moment, she turned back toward the table. Her voice carried a calm certainty. She said something that seemed simple. The town was going to learn the truth eventually. Better it started with facts. The sentence settled into the room. Because everyone understood what she meant, investigations produce records. Records become accessible. Timelines become conversations. Stories spread. My father looked at the house around him, the walls, the framed photographs, the dining table where every Thanksgiving had happened for as long as anyone could remember. Then he looked back at the paperwork. The center of gravity had shifted. Not inside the house, outside it. Daniel gathered the documents carefully, not to take them away, just to organize them. The compliance report beneath, the insurance letter on top, the signed dispute form placed carefully between them. The process had begun, but something else had begun too. Because once institutions start asking questions, the first answers rarely arrive where people expect them. And somewhere beyond this house, the systems that cared only about signatures and records had just received a name they were about to investigate. Part 19. The strange thing about decisions is that the moment they are made, the room that held them begins to feel different. Nothing in my parents' dining room had physically changed. The same candles burned along the table. The same plates of untouched pie sat cooling beside folded napkins. The same framed photographs watched from the walls, graduations, anniversaries, holidays that had once felt permanent. But something invisible had shifted. For years, the story inside this room had moved in one direction. Tonight, it had reversed. Daniel finished organizing the paperwork into a neat stack and placed it gently in front of me. He wasn't taking possession of it. That wasn't his role here. Compliance officers didn't collect evidence at dinner tables. But he understood the significance of the documents now. The dispute form had converted suspicion into procedure. And procedures move. My mother's eyes stayed on the stack of papers, as if staring long enough might somehow undo the ink at the bottom of the page. Her voice came quietly, almost hesitant. She asked when the banks would receive the form. Daniel answered without hesitation. It could be submitted immediately. Most institutions allow digital uploads through secure portals. Once received, automated systems would flag the accounts and initiate the identity verification process. He paused before adding something else. Those systems usually responded within 24 hours. The room absorbed that timeline carefully. 24 hours. That meant by tomorrow evening, the institutions involved would officially recognize the dispute. The review process would begin. My father leaned forward slowly. His voice sounded tired now. He asked whether the banks would contact the house directly. Daniel considered the question. Then he nodded slightly. Possibly. If the investigation required clarification about the application environment, investigators might request statements from anyone connected to the originating network. The originating network. The phrase had appeared earlier in the compliance report. The house's internet connection. The digital fingerprint attached to the applications. Everyone at the table understood that implication. The investigation would not stop with the account holder. A guest at the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably. He had known my father for nearly 20 years through local business circles. Now he cleared his throat gently. He said something that sounded more like an observation than a question. Once banks start asking questions, people tend to notice. No one disagreed, because communities have their own networks, just like financial institutions. Word travels quickly when something unusual happens. My mother closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she looked toward the window where Ava still stood. Her voice was softer now. She asked Ava if this was truly necessary. Ava didn't answer right away. She walked back to the table slowly and rested her hands on the back of her chair. Then she looked at both of our parents. Her voice carried the calm steadiness she used when managing difficult situations at the cafe she ran across town. She said something that sounded simple. The decision hadn't started tonight. It had started when the accounts were opened. The room held that thought carefully, because it shifted responsibility away from the signature on the dispute form and back to the moment the applications had been submitted. My father stared at the table. For years, he had believed that controlling the narrative meant controlling the outcome. But paperwork had its own gravity. It pulled events back toward the moment where decisions had actually been made. Daniel glanced toward the clock on the wall. The evening had stretched far longer than anyone expected when dinner began, yet no one seemed eager to leave. People remained seated, caught in the quiet aftermath of a story they had just watched change direction. One of my father's business associates finally spoke. His voice carried cautious curiosity. He asked whether investigators usually interviewed witnesses if a dispute involved property connected to multiple owners. Daniel answered carefully. Sometimes, especially when the timeline suggested the applications were submitted from a location shared by multiple people. The phrase witnesses hovered in the air. Several guests glanced at one another, because they had just spent the past 2 hours listening to the entire situation unfold. My mother noticed those glances. Her expression tightened slightly. She understood something my father had not fully processed yet. The story had not only left the house, it had left the family. 20 people now carried a different version of the Sinclair narrative. And stories, once shared, rarely stay contained. My father finally spoke again. His voice was quieter than it had been all evening. He said the town didn't need to know every detail of a family mistake. Daniel didn't respond. But the silence answered the statement well enough, because investigations create records, and records have a way of finding daylight. Ava sat down slowly. She looked across the table at me. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried something deeper. Relief. Not triumph, just relief. For years, she had watched the family system strain under tensions no one was willing to name. Tonight, those tensions had finally surfaced. My father looked at the dispute form again. Then he said something that sounded almost reflective. He said, reputations take decades to build and minutes to unravel. No one argued with that. But the hardware store owner who had spoken earlier cleared his throat again. He said reputations also depend on how people handle the moment when the truth appears. The sentence settled gently into the room, not accusatory, just factual. My mother looked away. My father said nothing. Daniel gathered his coat from the back of the chair. He wasn't leaving yet, but the gesture signaled that the evening had reached its natural conclusion. The dinner party had become something else entirely, a witness room, a place where documentation had confronted narrative. As the guests slowly began to stand and gather their things, Ava leaned slightly toward me. Her voice was low enough that only I could hear it. She said the town had believed the story about you for years. Then she glanced toward the stack of paperwork on the table and added quietly that the paperwork would give them a different story to tell now. Part 20. The guests didn't leave all at once. That would have felt too abrupt, too much like fleeing the aftermath of something uncomfortable. Instead, people moved slowly, politely, the way they always did at the end of my parents' holiday dinners. Chairs slid back, coats were lifted from the rack near the hallway. Quiet conversations formed in small clusters near the doorway. But the atmosphere was completely different from the one that had existed earlier in the evening. Before the toast, people had spoken easily, laughing about work and neighbors and weekend plans. Now the conversations were quieter, measured, and every once in a while someone's eyes drifted back toward the dining table where the paperwork still sat. Stories spread through communities in many ways, sometimes through gossip, sometimes through official records, and sometimes through rooms like this one, where 20 people had watched the same moment unfold. Daniel stood near the edge of the table, slipping his coat over his shoulders. Before leaving, he turned back toward me and spoke in a tone meant rather than formal. He said the dispute could be submitted through the secure portal tonight if I wanted the process to begin immediately. Otherwise, it could wait until morning. The timeline would not change significantly either way. But once the form was uploaded, the institutions involved would start moving quickly. I nodded. The stack of documents rested quietly in front of me. Compliance report, insurance notice, dispute form with my signature, now dry. My father still hadn't moved from his chair. For the first time in my life, he looked like a man who had run out of things to say. Not because he lacked words, he had always been good with words, but because words had stopped carrying authority. My mother stood slowly and began collecting the plates of pie from the table. The gesture felt automatic, something she had done after every family dinner for as long as anyone could remember. But tonight, even that familiar routine seemed fragile. She carried the plates into the kitchen one at a time, returning for more without speaking. Ava watched her for a moment, then stood to help. The two of them moved around each other quietly, the clinking of dishes echoing faintly from the kitchen. Near the doorway, one of the neighbors shook my hand gently before leaving. His voice carried the careful tone people use when they are unsure what to say but want to acknowledge something important has happened. He said, "The truth usually finds its way out eventually." Then he stepped into the night. More guests followed. Coats zipped, keys jingled. The front door opened and closed repeatedly as people slipped out into the cool New Orleans evening. Within 20 minutes, the room that had held 20 witnesses was nearly empty. Daniel was the last guest to leave. Before stepping out the door, he paused beside me. His voice was calm. He said, "Situations like this were never easy when they involved family, but documentation existed to make responsibility clear when stories became complicated." Then he gave a small nod and stepped into the night. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The house felt different without the audience. Quieter, heavier. Only 4 of us remained now. My father still sat at the table. My mother stood near the sink, staring at the stack of plates she had just washed. Ava leaned against the counter, her arms folded loosely, and I sat in the same chair where the evening had begun. The dispute form rested beneath my hand. My father finally spoke. His voice sounded rough. He asked if I had really planned this. The question carried no anger now, just exhaustion. I told him the truth. I hadn't planned the evening. I had only prepared the documentation. The timing had simply revealed itself. He nodded slowly. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Ava broke the silence. Her voice was gentle but direct. She said the system inside this house had lasted a long time, but systems break when the person carrying the blame stops doing it. My mother turned from the sink. Her eyes looked tired. She asked what would happen to the house if the investigation moved the way Daniel described. The question hung in the air like something fragile, because the house had always been the center of everything. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every version of the Sinclair story. I answered carefully. The investigation would determine responsibility for the accounts. If the applications were confirmed to have been submitted without authorization, the debts would move to whoever had opened them. Insurance companies might reassess the property. Banks might review credit structures tied to it. But none of that had started tonight. The timeline already existed. My father looked around the dining room slowly, at the photographs, at the long wooden table, at the empty chairs where guests had sat earlier. He said something quietly, almost to himself. He said he had spent his entire life making sure people respected this family. Ava's voice came softly from the kitchen. She said, "Respect usually survives the truth better than lies." My father didn't respond. He simply stared at the paperwork. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car engine started. The sound drifted faintly through the open window. The night in New Orleans moved forward the way it always did. But inside the Sinclair house, the story that had shaped every dinner, every conversation, every quiet accusation for years had reached a place it could never return from. I gathered the documents into the folder. The dispute form rested at the top. Tomorrow it would leave the house. And once it did, the truth about the Sinclair family would no longer belong to the people who had tried to rewrite it. It would belong to the records that remembered everything. Part 21. The house felt different the morning after Thanksgiving. Not quieter exactly. New Orleans mornings rarely are. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck rattled past. A neighbor's dog barked twice and then settled down again. The faint sound of someone sweeping a sidewalk drifted through the open kitchen window. But inside the Sinclair house, something had shifted permanently. For years, mornings here followed a predictable rhythm after family gatherings. Coffee brewed early. My mother moved through the kitchen, restoring order from the night before. My father read the paper at the dining table, occasionally commenting on local news, as if the world outside the house existed primarily to reinforce his sense of stability. Today, that rhythm had collapsed. The dining table was still there, of course. The same polished wood, reflecting the soft morning light. But the stack of newspapers that usually rested beside my father's chair remained untouched, and the seat itself was empty. I had woken early. Old habit from years of opening the restaurant before sunrise. Even when I slept somewhere else, my body rarely forgot that schedule. The folder sat on the kitchen counter where I had placed it before going to bed. Inside it, the dispute form waited, signed, ready. 3 weeks earlier, the envelope from the bank had arrived quietly at my restaurant office. Now the consequence of opening it was sitting inside my parents' kitchen. Ava appeared in the doorway behind me. Her hair was still slightly damp from a shower, and she carried 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to me without speaking. For a moment, we stood side by side at the counter, looking at the folder. Neither of us needed to open it again. We both knew exactly what was inside. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm. She asked if I was going to submit it today. I nodded. The secure portal Daniel had mentioned would take less than 5 minutes. Scan, upload, confirmation. From there, the systems would begin their work. Banks contacting internal review teams, utility companies verifying application logs, insurance providers cross-checking ownership records. Ava took a sip of coffee. Then she said something that sounded almost reflective. She said the house felt different this morning. I knew what she meant. Not physically different, but emotionally. Like a stage after the audience had gone home and the performance had ended. My mother entered the kitchen a few minutes later. She looked as though she hadn't slept much. The careful composure she had maintained for decades had thinned overnight. She saw the folder immediately. Her eyes rested on it for several seconds before moving toward me. She asked if the form had already been submitted. Not yet. The answer seemed to land heavily in the room because it meant the final moment still existed, a small window of time where the story could technically be reversed. She leaned against the counter slowly. Her voice was quiet. She said once the banks received it, there would be no way to stop what followed. Investigators would call, records would be requested, the timeline would spread. Yes, that was how documentation worked. My father appeared in the doorway. He had already dressed for the day, pressed shirt, polished shoes, the same careful presentation he used every morning before heading into town. But something about him looked smaller. Not physically, just diminished. He looked at the folder, then at me. He didn't ask if I intended to submit it. He already knew. Instead, he asked what time the banks would receive it. I told him the truth. Within minutes, once it was uploaded. He nodded slowly, then walked to the dining room table and sat down in the chair he had occupied for decades. From the kitchen, Ava and I could see him staring at the empty place settings left from the night before, the evidence of a dinner that had turned into something else entirely. A witness room. My mother picked up the folder. Her fingers rested on the edge for a moment before she handed it back to me. Her voice sounded fragile. She said the house had always been meant to hold the family together. The sentence lingered quietly between us. Ava answered gently. She said houses hold people, but stories hold families. And the story inside this house had been breaking for a long time. I stepped into the small office near the hallway. The same room where my father used to keep business records when I was younger. The laptop sat on the desk. The dispute form waited inside the folder. I scanned the document. The printer hummed softly as it created the digital file. Then I opened the secure portal Daniel had described. Account holder verification. Upload supporting documentation. I attached the compliance report, the insurance notice, the signed dispute form, 3 files, 3 confirmations. My finger hovered over the final button for a moment. Submit identity dispute. Through the doorway, I could see my father sitting at the dining table, my mother standing silently beside the counter, Ava watching from the hallway. For years, this house had contained the narrative about the difficult son, the irresponsible one, the burden. Now the documentation told something else. I clicked submit, the screen refreshed, confirmation received, case reference number generated, institutional review initiated. The process had begun. I closed the laptop slowly. When I returned to the dining room, my father looked up. He didn't ask what the screen had said. He simply studied my face for a moment, then nodded once. Not approval, not forgiveness. Just recognition that the story he had spent decades protecting had finally left the house, and somewhere beyond the Sinclair family dining room, institutions that cared only about signatures and timelines had begun asking their first questions. Part 22. The first message arrived before noon. Not a phone call, not a letter, just a small notification on my phone while I was back at the restaurant, standing near the prep counter as the kitchen staff moved through the quiet rhythm of post-holiday cleanup. Case reference confirmation. Institutional review initiated. The language was clinical, efficient, the kind of wording designed to remove emotion from a process that often carried plenty of it for the people involved. But the meaning behind the message was simple. The system had started moving. Inside the restaurant, the smell of garlic and stock simmering in a pot filled the air. Lunch service would begin in a few hours. The clatter of knives against cutting boards created a steady background rhythm. Life outside the Sinclair house had already resumed its usual pace, which was exactly why I had built the restaurant in the first place. Work has a way of restoring perspective. Ava texted me shortly after the notification arrived. 2 words. They called. I stepped outside onto the small back patio behind the restaurant and called her back. She answered immediately. Her voice sounded calm, but I could hear the faint tension underneath it. The banks had already reached out, not to her directly, to the house. The first call had come from the credit institution listed on the compliance report. They had confirmed the dispute submission. Then, they asked a question that began the next phase of the process. Who else had access to the internet network listed on the application logs? I leaned against the railing of the patio. Sunlight reflected off the nearby buildings of the French Quarter just a few blocks away. Tourists were already beginning to fill the sidewalks. A completely ordinary New Orleans afternoon. Inside the Sinclair house, the timeline was unfolding. Ava continued explaining. The investigator had been polite, professional. They had requested a recorded statement from the account holder first. That would be me. Then they mentioned something else. Because the applications had been submitted from a residential network tied to a property with multiple listed owners, the investigators would likely request clarification from the other occupants as well. Exactly the process Daniel had described. Statements, verification, documentation. My father had taken the call. Ava said his voice had remained calm throughout the conversation. Careful, measured. But once he hung up, he had sat at the dining table for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. My mother had asked what the investigator said. He answered with one sentence. They want to know who opened the accounts. I could picture the scene perfectly. The same dining room. The same table where the Thanksgiving toast had been delivered less than 24 hours earlier. Only now the story inside the house had been replaced by questions from outside it. Ava asked when the restaurant would close tonight. I told her late as usual. She said she might stop by after work. Then she paused before adding something else. The insurance company had called too. That detail made me straighten slightly. Insurance reviews move differently from bank investigations. They look at risk, property liability, ownership structures. Ava explained the conversation. The representative had confirmed the letter sent earlier in the month. Then they asked whether the outstanding utility accounts connected to the property had been resolved. My father had answered honestly. The matter was under review, which meant the insurer would monitor the outcome of the investigation. Not dramatic, but significant, because insurance companies care about patterns, and patterns create files. I ended the call with Ava and returned inside the restaurant. Lunch service began soon after. Orders came in steadily: seafood gumbo, blackened redfish, po' boys for tourists who had read about the place online. For several hours, the restaurant demanded my full attention, and that was good. Work always felt simpler than family systems. In the evening, just as the dinner crowd began filling the tables, another notification arrived. Identity dispute status update. Preliminary verification completed. The banks had confirmed something already noted in the compliance report. The signatures used on the applications did not match verified signature records for Miles Sinclair. The message included another detail. Investigators would now review application metadata, network origin, device identifiers, submission timestamps. The process had officially moved into evidence collection. Across town, inside the Sinclair house, those words would soon carry enormous weight, because metadata doesn't care about family narratives. It records actions. I finished the dinner service late that night. The restaurant emptied slowly, chairs stacked, lights dimmed, staff heading home through the warm Louisiana night. As I locked the front door, Ava pulled up outside in her car. She stepped out and leaned against the hood, looking tired but steady. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. They called again this afternoon. The bank had scheduled the first formal statement for tomorrow morning. My statement. And shortly after that, investigators planned to speak with the other property owners listed on the deed, our parents. Ava looked up at the dark sky above the French Quarter, then back at me. The town had believed the Sinclair story for years. Tomorrow, the institutions that recorded facts instead of stories would begin asking the people inside that story to explain it. Part 23. The call from the bank came at 9:02 the next morning. Not 9:00, not 9:05, exactly 9:02. That detail stayed with me because it reminded me of something I had learned during years of running a restaurant. Institutions run on schedules the way kitchens run on timing. When systems move, they move with quiet precision. I was sitting in the small office behind the restaurant dining room when the phone rang. The same office where invoices, supplier contracts, and payroll records were stored in neat folders along the shelves. Documentation had always been part of survival for me. Today it had become something else. Protection. I answered the call. The investigator introduced herself clearly and confirmed my identity before proceeding. Her tone was calm, neutral, professional, the same tone Daniel had used at the dinner table. This was not a conversation about emotions. This was a conversation about records. She explained that the bank had completed the preliminary verification phase of the dispute. The signatures on the accounts did not match verified records associated with my identification. The investigation had now entered the application review stage. She asked me several questions. Had I ever authorized anyone to open accounts under my name? No. Had I ever shared my identification details for financial applications related to the property? No. Had I signed or electronically approved any of the listed accounts? No. Each answer was recorded. The investigator then explained something that made the situation feel more concrete than it had the night before. The metadata attached to the applications had already been retrieved. Submission timestamps, network origin, device information, digital footprints that quietly followed every online form submission. The applications had been submitted from the residential network connected to the Sinclair property, the same house where Thanksgiving dinner had taken place, the same house where my father had raised his glass and spoken about family responsibility. The investigator thanked me for the information and explained the next step. They would now contact the other individuals connected to the property network and ownership structure. Statements would be collected, application access points verified, and once the timeline was complete, responsibility for the accounts would be reassigned accordingly. The call lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, I sat in the quiet office for a moment looking at the shelves of organized paperwork around me. Records have a strange power. They don't argue. They simply wait for someone to read them. Across town, Ava texted me shortly afterward. They called the house. I could picture the scene again. My father at the dining table, my mother standing near the kitchen, the same place where the family story had been repeated for years. Now that story was facing a timeline. Ava told me later what had happened. The investigator had spoken with my father first. He remained composed, calm, the same careful voice he used when handling difficult conversations in business meetings. But the questions were different from anything he had encountered before. Who had access to the home internet network during the application dates? Who handled financial paperwork related to property utilities? Who possessed copies of my identification documents? The investigator asked each question slowly, methodically, because the answers would become part of the record. My mother had tried to explain the financial stress the family experienced during those years. Storm damage, insurance delays, unexpected repairs. The investigator listened politely, then she repeated a simple clarification. Authorization had not been given. That detail changed everything, because financial hardship explains decisions. It does not authorize identity use. Ava told me my father had fallen quiet after that. The conversation had lasted nearly 20 minutes. When it ended, the investigator thanked him for his time and explained that additional documentation would be reviewed. Network logs, application devices, verification records, evidence collection. My father remained at the dining table after the call ended, the same table where the Thanksgiving toast had happened. Only now the story had moved outside the house. Ava said he stared at the framed photographs on the wall for a long time. Graduations, birthdays, holiday dinners, moments carefully preserved as proof of family stability. But photographs capture appearances. Documentation captures actions. By late afternoon, another notification arrived on my phone. Investigation status update. Application metadata review completed. The message included a short summary. Device identifiers associated with the applications had been traced to a laptop registered to the Sinclair residence. Submission timestamps corresponded with dates when the property owners were present at the house. The review process would now proceed to responsibility determination. In simpler terms, the system had reconstructed the moment when the accounts were opened. Step by step. Action by action. No narratives. Just records. That evening, Ava came by the restaurant again. She sat at the small corner table near the kitchen entrance while the dinner rush filled the room with noise and motion. When things finally quieted down near closing time, she told me what the house felt like now. Different. The old rhythm was gone. My father had spent most of the day in his office without making phone calls. My mother had reorganized the kitchen twice. Small movements people make when they are trying to control something. Ava looked around the restaurant. The steady hum of the place, customers finishing their meals, staff wiping down tables. Then she looked back at me. Her voice was thoughtful. She said something that stayed with me long after she left. For years, the family had survived because everyone believed the story about the scapegoat. Now the institutions had replaced the story with a timeline, and timelines once recorded, don't forget. Part 24. The final notice arrived 8 days after Thanksgiving. Not with drama, not with accusations, just a formal email containing a document attachment and a reference number. Institutional review outcome. I opened it in the same small office behind the restaurant where the first investigator had called the week before. Outside the window, the lunch crowd had already begun forming along the street. The sounds of the French Quarter moved through their usual rhythm. Tourists laughing, delivery trucks unloading supplies, the distant hum of music from a bar opening its doors early. Life outside the Sinclair family story had continued exactly as it always did. Inside the email, the document told the ending. The investigation had concluded that the accounts were opened without authorization from the identity holder. Application signatures had been verified as inconsistent with my recorded identification documents. Network logs confirmed the submissions originated from the Sinclair residence. Device identifiers connected the application sessions to a laptop registered to the property. Based on those findings, the institutions had reassigned responsibility for the accounts. The debts were removed from my identity record. The accounts were transferred to the individuals determined to have initiated the applications. Financial liability updated, case closed. The language was direct, clinical, efficient, but the consequences were anything but small. Because institutions record outcomes, and those outcomes travel. I closed the document and sat back in the chair for a moment. 8 days. That was all it had taken for the timeline to replace the narrative. Across town, the Sinclair house had already begun feeling the shift. Ava had told me pieces of it over the past few days. Bank calls arriving at the house instead of my phone, insurance representatives requesting updated documentation, the property insurer scheduling a reassessment review connected to the financial irregularities. None of it loud, none of it dramatic, just processes. Processes that move forward whether people like the outcome or not. That afternoon, Ava came by the restaurant again. She slid into the same corner seat she had used earlier in the week. When the lunch rush slowed down, I walked over and placed a printed copy of the outcome report on the table. She read it slowly. Her eyes moved across each line with careful attention. Then she set the paper down and exhaled softly. "So that's it," she said. "In some ways, yes. In others, not even close. Because investigations close files. But families have to live with what the files reveal." Ava folded the paper once and rested her hands on it. She said the bank had already contacted our parents that morning. Responsibility for the accounts had been formally reassigned. Payment arrangements would be negotiated directly with them. My father hadn't argued, at least not according to Ava. He had listened quietly while the representative explained the findings. Then he had asked for the documentation. The same man who once believed stories controlled everything now wanted copies of the paperwork. Records, evidence, timelines. My mother had cried when the call ended. Not loudly, just the quiet kind of crying that comes when someone realizes a narrative they depended on has finally been replaced by facts. The town had started noticing too. Nothing explosive. Just small conversations, questions about the insurance review, whispers about financial corrections connected to the house, stories moving slowly through the same community networks that once carried the old version of the Sinclair family. But the difference now was simple. This time, the story had documentation behind it. Ava looked around the restaurant again. The place was filling up for dinner. The kitchen buzzed with the sound of pans and orders being called out. She smiled faintly. "You know what the strangest part is," she said. I asked what she meant. "For years, everyone believed the story about you," she said. "The difficult son, the irresponsible one, the burden." She tapped the printed investigation report lightly with one finger. And now the only thing that changed the entire story was paperwork. She wasn't wrong. Because the truth about family systems is something people rarely talk about openly. Every system chooses a role for each person inside it. Someone leads, someone smooths things over, and sometimes someone carries the blame. That system survives until something stronger than the narrative appears. Documentation, witnesses, adult competence, all the things that don't care about family mythology. I walked her to the door when she left. The early evening air carried the warm humidity of New Orleans. The street outside the restaurant buzzed with life. Before getting into her car, Ava turned back toward me. Her voice carried a quiet certainty. She said the Sinclair family had spent years trying to protect a story that wasn't true, but the town had finally seen something different. Not the scapegoat, not the burden, just a man who kept records long enough for the truth to catch up. She drove away a moment later. I locked the restaurant doors after the dinner crowd finally faded. Inside the office, the printed investigation report rested in a folder with the original compliance notice and the dispute form. 3 documents, the same 3 that had changed everything. Outside, the city moved forward like it always did. And somewhere across town, inside the Sinclair house where the Thanksgiving toast had once rewritten the past, the people who had controlled the story for years were finally learning something institutions have always understood. Signatures matter more than stories.